The road into the Boundary Waters was a frozen ribbon through a sea of snow, the trees standing like silent sentinels under heavy blankets of ice. The RV's heater hummed steadily, but even that couldn't keep the biting cold out. I was deep into the wilderness now, the place I'd picked to spend a week. Just me, the frozen lake, and the stillness of winter. I'd been coming to places like this for years, ever since the accident. The solitude was the only thing that seemed to quiet my mind. This time, I was here to ice fish, maybe snap a few photos for my nature blog, but mostly, I was here to prove to myself that I could still handle it. The cold, the isolation, the memories. I pulled the RV to a stop by a small frozen lake I'd scouted on a map. It was miles away from the nearest town, completely off the grid, just how I liked it. I stepped out into the icy air, my breath fogging in front of me as I took in the sight. The lake was a vast white expanse, the ice thick enough to drive on, stretching out into the distance where the trees disappeared into a blur of white. Perfect. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV near the shoreline and gathering my gear for ice fishing. The cold had a way of creeping into your bones out here, but I didn't mind. I was used to it. I grabbed my auger, trudged out onto the ice, and started drilling a hole. The sound of the blade biting into the ice echoed through the stillness, sharp and harsh against the quiet of the wilderness. Then I heard it. A deep, low rumble that seemed to come from beneath the ice. I paused, the auger still in my hands, and listened. The sound came again. A low, distant vibration, like the ice shifting far beneath the surface. I'd heard ice groan before. Anyone who spends enough time in the cold knows the sound of a lake adjusting to the freeze, but this was different. It was deeper, longer, almost like something was moving down there. I brushed it off and kept drilling. By the time the hole was ready, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. I set up my fishing gear, lowered the line into the icy water, and settled in to wait. The cold crept in quickly, even through my heavy coat, but I was prepared for it. I'd done this 100 times before, and the routine was comforting. But that sound, the rumble beneath the ice, kept creeping back into my thoughts. As night fell, I lit a small fire near the shore, the flames flickering weakly against the chill. I sat by the fire, staring out at the frozen expanse of the lake. The stars were starting to appear in the clear sky above, bright and distant. Then I saw it. A light, faintly flickering and coming from beneath the ice. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe the moonlight hitting the ice in just the right way. But as I watched, the light moved slow and steady, as if something was drifting beneath the surface. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it was still there, faint and regular, like a lantern swaying beneath the ice. I stood, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the lake. The light seemed to pulse, growing brighter for a moment, then dimming again, always moving, always just out of reach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a reflection of something from the sky. But deep down, I knew better. There was no one else out here, no one who could be moving under the ice. The rumble came again, louder this time, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. I took a step back, suddenly feeling exposed out there on the open ice. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I turned back toward the RV, my mind racing. The light, the sound, something wasn't right. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back out onto the lake, determined to make sense of it all. The sun was barely up, and the cold was more biting than ever. As I walked, I glanced back toward the hole I'd drilled the day before. Something was off. There, by the edge of the hole, was a long, jagged crack running across the ice. The crack hadn't been there yesterday. It snaked out in a jagged line, as if something had pressed up from below. I knelt down, running my gloved fingers along the crack, feeling the cold seeping through the ice. The surface felt thin, too thin for the middle of winter. Then I noticed something glinting just beneath the ice. I leaned closer, peering into the crack. At first, it looked like a piece of metal, rusted and sharp, lodged beneath the surface. I reached into the cold water, pulling it free. It was old, jagged, like part of a machine. but there was no reason for it to be here. The nearest road was miles away, and there hadn't been any mining or construction in the area for years. The metal was strange, sharp and smooth, like it had been cut clean. As I held the piece in my hand, the rumbling came again, louder now, closer. I stood quickly, scanning the lake. The light was back, faint but steady, moving beneath the ice, closer than before. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out under my coat. Something was down there. Something was moving. I backed away from the crack, my mind racing. The metal, the light, the sound, it all pointed to something beneath the ice. Something unnatural. But what? The stories I had heard over the years about strange things beneath the frozen lakes, about disappearances and creatures buried deep in the ice, came flooding back. I'd always dismissed them as nonsense, campfire stories to scare the newcomers. But now, standing there in the middle of the frozen lake, I wasn't so sure. I needed answers. Later that day, as I was gathering more firewood, I came across an old ice fishing shack near the edge of the lake that looked abandoned. But there were fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the door. Curious, I approached, knocking lightly before pushing the door open. Inside, I found an older man hunched over a small stove, warming his hands. His face was weathered, his beard streaked with gray, and he looked up at me with tired eyes as I stepped in. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Not many come this deep into the wilderness." I hesitated. "I've been hearing strange sounds under the ice, and I saw a light last night moving beneath the surface. Do you know anything about that?" The man's expression darkened. He turned back to the stove, staring into the flames. "You shouldn't be out on that lake," he said quietly. "There are things beneath the ice, things that shouldn't be disturbed." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. The man sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "There's an old mining operation under that lake, abandoned long ago. They were digging deep, too deep. Some say they woke something up down there. Ever since, strange things have happened. People go missing. The ice breaks when it shouldn't. And that light, it's not the only thing that moves down there." A chill ran down my spine. "What's under there?" The man shook his head. "I don't know. But I've been coming out here for years, and I've seen enough to know when something isn't right. The lake's alive. It's watching you." That night, the light beneath the ice returned, brighter than before, pulsing like a heartbeat. I watched from the RV, my breath fogging up the window, as the rumbling beneath the ice grew louder, more insistent. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was beneath the lake, it was waking up. I packed my gear quickly, throwing everything into the RV, but as I started the engine, the ground beneath the RV began to tremble. The rumbling was almost deafening now, vibrating up through the frozen earth. I glanced out toward the lake, and my blood ran cold. The ice was cracking, long fissures spreading out from the center of the lake. And then, in the distance, the surface of the ice exploded upward, a massive shape breaking through. I only caught a glimpse, something dark and enormous, sliding beneath the ice again, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. But it was enough. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward as I raced away from the lake, the sound of cracking ice echoing behind me. The road was a blur, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I drove, I could still feel it, the weight of something massive beneath the surface, watching, waiting. When I finally reached the main road, the rumbling stopped, but the memory of that thing beneath the ice stayed with me. I'll never forget it. The way the light pulsed, the way the ice cracked as if it were alive. I left the boundary waters behind, but a part of me knows I'll never truly escape it. Some things should stay buried, and whatever's beneath that lake, it's not finished yet. My name is Sean Walker, and back in 2016, I found myself deep in the wilds of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, looking for a bit of solitude and maybe a good fishing spot. I've always preferred the company of trees over people. Not that I'm antisocial, just that nature doesn't argue back. I'd packed my gear, loaded up my old Jeep, and decided to take a week off from my job as a mechanic in Knoxville. The drive to the park was uneventful, the kind of peaceful journey where the miles slip by and the radio's static becomes comforting background noise. I arrived at a lesser-known trailhead, one that a buddy had tipped me off about. "Best trout you'll ever taste," he'd said, swearing me to secrecy. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I started down the path. About an hour into the hike, I came across an old wooden sign, half swallowed by moss. Carter's Creek, 2 miles. Perfect. The trail narrowed, branches occasionally snagging my backpack, as if the forest were playing little pranks on me. I laughed it off. Better the trees than my coworkers, with their endless jokes about my so-called hermit tendencies. As I got closer to the creek, the sound of rushing water grew louder, accompanied by the distant call of a hawk. The serenity was exactly what I'd been craving. When I reached the water, I set up camp nearby, pitching my tent on a flat patch of ground and gathering stones to make a fire pit. By late afternoon, I'd caught a couple of decent-sized trout and was roasting them over the flames. The taste was everything my friend had promised and more. Just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the water, I noticed something odd. Across the creek, about 50 yards upstream, a deer stood frozen, its ears perked and body tense. It wasn't drinking or grazing. It was just staring into the dense thicket. I followed its gaze, but saw nothing unusual. Must be a predator nearby, I thought aloud. Circle of life and all that. I settled back down, but an uneasy feeling crept over me. The deer bolted suddenly, disappearing into the trees with a swift grace that belied its size. Shrugging it off, I tossed another log onto the fire and pulled out a book, figuring some reading would take my mind off the eerie stillness that had settled in. Night fell, and the sounds of the forest changed. The chirping of birds gave way to the hum of insects and the occasional hoot of an owl. I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire to burn down to embers. Sleep came easily. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to the sound of rustling outside. Probably a raccoon drawn by the scent of cooked fish. I ignored it at first, but then the rustling turned into a heavy crunching of leaves and snapping branches. Whatever it was big. "Great, a black bear," I muttered, grabbing the flashlight and the bear spray from my pack. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees but revealing nothing. The sounds had stopped. "Hello?" I called out, feeling a bit foolish for talking to a wild animal. Silence. Then a low rumbling sound echoed from the darkness. Not quite a growl, but something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It reminded me of the noise a large dog makes when protecting its territory, but deeper, more primal. "Easy now," I whispered, gripping the bear spray tighter. I scanned the area with the flashlight, moving it slowly from left to right. For a moment, I thought I saw a pair of eyes reflecting back at me, but they vanished as quickly as they appeared. Deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, I retreated back into my tent and secured the zipper. Sleep wouldn't come, so I sat there, listening intently. The forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. No insects, no owls, nothing. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As dawn broke, I emerged from the tent to survey the campsite. Everything seemed in order until I noticed footprints by the dying fire. They were unlike any tracks I'd seen before, large, with an odd shape, almost like a wolf's but much bigger. "Well, that's not in any field guide," I said, snapping a photo with my phone. Maybe I could look it up later or ask one of the park rangers. Shaking off the night's events, I decided to spend the day exploring further upstream. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating patterns on the forest floor that danced as the wind moved the branches. I found another promising spot and cast my line, letting the tranquility wash over me. Around midday, as I was reeling in a particularly feisty trout, I heard a scream. Not an animal's cry, but a human scream, echoing through the trees. It was cut short abruptly. Dropping the fishing rod, I grabbed my pack and headed in the direction of the sound. "Hello? Anyone out there?" I called. No response. I pushed through the underbrush, branches whipping against my arms and face. After about 10 minutes of scrambling, I stumbled into a small clearing and froze. There on the ground was a backpack, torn to shreds. Scattered around it were clothes soaked in blood and a crumpled map of the park. No sign of the person who owned them. This doesn't look like a simple accident, I thought, my heart pounding. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but had no signal. Typical. The smart move would be to head back to my campsite, pack up, and make for the trailhead. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of something hanging from a low branch, a tattered piece of fabric fluttering in the breeze. It looked like part of a shirt, stained dark. A sense of dread settled in my stomach. I needed to alert the authorities. I retraced my steps, marking trees with my knife to find the spot again if needed. Back at my campsite, I hastily threw everything into my backpack. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Get a grip, Ezekiel, I told myself. Just a couple of miles to the Jeep. I set off at a brisk pace, constantly checking over my shoulder. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming before, now felt oppressive. About halfway to the trailhead, I came across footprints similar to the ones I'd seen earlier, but fresher. They crossed the path and headed deeper into the woods. A chill ran through me, not from the air, but from the realization that whatever made those prints was circling me. I quickened my pace, almost breaking into a jog. Then, ahead on the trail, I saw something that made me stop cold. Another hiker was lying face down on the path, motionless. I approached cautiously. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. No response. As I got closer, the scene became gruesomely clear. The hiker's clothes were shredded, and there were deep gashes along his back. The ground was stained. I fought back the urge to be sick. This was no animal attack. Not any animal I'd ever heard of. A rustling sound came from the bushes to my left. I turned slowly, and there it was. A massive creature stood partially obscured by the foliage. It was covered in dark, matted fur, standing on two legs like a human, but with the head and features reminiscent of a wolf, or perhaps a bear, but not quite either. Its eyes were fixed on me, intelligent and predatory. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I bolted down the trail, adrenaline fueling my legs. The sound of heavy footsteps crashed behind me, gaining quickly. Come on, I urged myself, lungs burning. I spotted a fallen tree ahead and ducked behind it, hoping to throw the creature off. Peering through a gap in the logs, I saw it enter the clearing, sniffing the air. Up close, it was even more terrifying, a nightmare amalgamation of man and beast. It moved slowly, deliberately, scanning the area. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure it would hear me. Then, from another part of the forest, a gunshot rang out. The creature snapped its head in that direction and let out a sound, a mix between a howl and a roar that shook me to my core. Taking advantage of the distraction, I crept away from my hiding spot, careful to keep low. I made it back to the trail and continued running. Minutes later, I burst into the parking area where my Jeep awaited. Another vehicle was there, a ranger truck. Relief washed over me. A park ranger stepped out, hand on his sidearm. "Whoa there, what's going on?" he asked, noticing my disheveled state. There's something out there," I gasped. "I found a dead hiker, and some kind of animal is chasing me." His face turned serious. "Show me." "Are you kidding? We need backup." "Sir, I can't call in anything without verifying." "Now, where did you see the body?" Realizing he wasn't going to budge, I agreed to lead him back, hoping that daylight and his firearm would offer some protection. As we retraced my steps, I kept glancing around nervously. The forest seemed even quieter than before. We reached the spot where I'd found the hiker, but the body was gone. Only a dark stain on the ground remained. "I swear he was right here," I insisted. The ranger looked skeptical. "Maybe you're dehydrated or—" A sudden noise interrupted him, a guttural sound from behind. Before we could react, the creature lunged at the ranger, knocking him to the ground. I stood paralyzed as the beast slashed at him. The ranger's scream snapped me out of it. I grabbed a large branch and swung it at the creature's back. It barely flinched, but it was enough to divert its attention. "Run!" I shouted, though the ranger was beyond hearing. The creature turned its gaze to me, blood dripping from its jaws. I backed away slowly, then threw the branch directly at its face. It snarled and charged. I sprinted through the trees, leaving the trail in a desperate attempt to lose it. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but adrenaline numbed the pain. Up ahead, I saw a rocky outcrop, a small cave entrance. Without thinking, I dove inside, squeezing through the narrow opening. The creature crashed against the entrance, too large to follow. It clawed at the opening, furious. I pressed myself against the back wall, the stench of damp earth filling my nostrils. After what felt like hours, the sound subsided. Cautiously, I peeked outside. The creature was gone. I made my way back to the parking area, keeping to the shadows and moving as quietly as possible. The ranger's truck was still there, but he was not. I didn't waste any time. Jumping into my Jeep, I fumbled with the keys before finally getting the engine started. I tore out of there, gravel spraying from under the tires. On the drive back to Knoxville, my mind raced. What was that thing? How could it exist without anyone knowing? Once home, I contacted the authorities. They organized a search party, but no trace of the ranger or the missing hikers was found. Just the torn backpacks and bloodied clothes I had described. Unsatisfied, I started digging. Late nights were spent combing through local legends, police reports, and old newspaper clippings. I discovered that over the past few decades, there had been sporadic disappearances in that area of the park, all unexplained and quickly forgotten. Some articles mentioned sightings of a large, unidentified animal. A few even hinted at a government cover-up, but those were dismissed as conspiracy theories. I compiled everything I found and handed it over to a journalist friend, hoping he could bring attention to the matter. In the end, official reports chalked up the incidents to unfortunate accidents, bear attacks, hikers getting lost in the wilderness. But I knew better. The Great Smoky Mountains held a secret, one that prowled the depths of the forest under the cloak of night, an apex predator unknown to science. As for me, I've traded camping trips for quiet weekends at home. Nature, it seems, has its own mysteries, and some are best left undisturbed. My name is Dylan Gonzalez, and this all went down in 2019 while I was out RV camping in the middle of Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska. I decided to head up there solo for a couple of weeks, just a break from my always-on work life back in Seattle. It felt like a good way to clear my mind and see some rugged places where cell towers hadn't yet claimed the landscape. Honestly, I had no idea just how off the grid I'd really find myself. I parked the RV in a designated camping area near Nebezna Road, figuring the isolation was the whole point. That day, I'd driven hours on a gravel road with almost no one around. I didn't even see another vehicle once I hit the unpaved stretch leading to the park. To be honest, the silence was nice, a pure kind of quiet that's almost sacred. So I set up a little campfire, had a beer, watched the last light fade, and crawled into my sleeping bag inside the RV, expecting just a quiet night. It was around midnight when I heard footsteps. I snapped awake, suddenly aware of every sound outside. I waited, lying still, thinking maybe it was a moose or some other large animal that had wandered too close. But after a minute, the steps seemed too deliberate, too human. They circled the RV slowly, like someone inspecting it. I reached for my phone, only to remember there was no reception. My only company was the emergency satellite phone stashed away under the seat. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped, and I thought maybe whoever or whatever it was had moved on. But as I strained to listen, a soft scratching sound came from the driver's side door. My blood ran cold. Someone was trying to open it. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the door, holding my breath. The scratching stopped. Then, in the dim light cast by the flashlight, I saw the outline of a man's face twisted into a faint smile through the window. I don't scare easily, but something about that grin sent a chill through me. He didn't look like a regular guy lost in the woods. He was wearing an old, dirty parka with a hood that almost obscured his face, save for that bizarre smile. I froze, not wanting to move, hoping he'd get bored and leave. But he kept staring, his face unmoving. Finally, I gathered the nerve to say, "Can I help you?" The man didn't respond. He just kept watching, standing there with that same unsettling expression. He then tilted his head slightly, as if he were studying me. That's when I noticed he had something shiny in his hand. A hunting knife. I felt a surge of adrenaline. No way was this a friendly encounter. He moved to the back of the RV, and I heard him jiggling the door handle. I knew I couldn't just sit there, so I grabbed a hatchet I'd brought along for chopping firewood. The guy must have realized he wasn't going to get in because, after a moment, everything went quiet. I waited, breathing hard, trying to calm my nerves. Minutes passed, and I started to think maybe he'd given up. I dared to peek out the window, but there was no sign of him. I decided to take my chances and get out to confront him, or at the very least, see if I could spot him from a safer distance. Outside, it was pitch black except for the faint glow from my flashlight. The silence was so intense that even the rustle of a nearby bush sounded like thunder. I slowly circled the RV, clutching the hatchet, listening for any movement. Then, in the beam of my flashlight, I caught sight of something that made my stomach drop. A freshly dug hole, maybe 6 feet long, near the tree line. I was staring at what looked like a makeshift grave. I took a step back, but before I could react, I heard his voice from somewhere behind me, calm and unbothered. Thought I'd get started on it early. I whipped around, the flashlight trembling in my hand, and there he was, standing a few yards away, his face now fully visible. He was middle-aged, rugged, with a look that screamed he'd spent far too many nights alone in the wilderness. His face was drawn, gaunt, and his lips stretched into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. That's when I saw he wasn't alone. Behind him, 2 others emerged from the trees, one carrying a shovel, the other a length of rope. My mind raced. There was no way I could take on 3 people with just a hatchet. I was too far from the RV to make a run for it without getting caught. For a brief, desperate moment, I thought about negotiating. But what was I supposed to say? "Sorry, I accidentally parked in your grave digging spot." The first man stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I took a step back, trying to keep the flashlight on him. He raised the knife, running a finger along the blade as if savoring the tension. "People don't usually camp here alone," he said, voice low. "What makes you so special?" I didn't answer. Instead, I tightened my grip on the hatchet, ready to swing if he got any closer. But just then, I heard a distant sound, an engine, maybe a truck, coming down the road. The man glanced toward the sound, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Without another word, he motioned to the others, and they retreated back into the trees, leaving me standing there alone, heart pounding. I didn't wait to see if they'd come back. I scrambled back into the RV, locked the doors, and grabbed the satellite phone. When I finally got through to the Rangers, I told them about the grave, the men, everything. They said they'd send someone out, but it could take hours for them to reach such a remote spot. By the time the Rangers arrived, the men were long gone, but they found something chilling, a series of shallow graves scattered throughout the woods. They contained the remains of people who had vanished over the years. Campers, hikers, even a few locals. The man I'd encountered was a suspected serial killer known to prey on people camping alone in remote areas, moving from park to park, always managing to slip through the cracks. The Rangers warned me that it might be a while before they caught him, but they assured me they'd be on the lookout. I left the park the next day, cutting my trip short. I wasn't expecting much when I decided to go camping. I just needed some time away from everything. The endless noise of the city, the constant work, the stress. I figured a weekend in the middle of nowhere would do me good. No people, no obligations, just me and the stars. At first, I had planned on going with some friends, but they all bailed. I didn't want to back out, so I went alone. The plan was simple: find a quiet spot, park my RV, set up camp, and just be. I found this campsite just off some back roads in Texas. It was far enough away from the nearest town to feel isolated, but not so far that it was dangerous. I figured I'd be fine. The worst that could happen was I'd get a little bored, right? I showed up, set up my RV, and got a small fire going. Nothing crazy, just a few logs to keep warm. I had brought a cooler with some food, a couple of beers, and some books to read. As the night crept in, everything started to feel calm, too calm almost. The trees were dead still, the wind barely moved, the kind of silence that feels unnatural after a while. But I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just getting paranoid. It's easy to do when you're alone. I spent the evening just relaxing. I ate a simple meal, nothing fancy, grilled a few sausages, had some chips. I opened a beer and stared into the fire, watching the flames flicker. I remember feeling weirdly calm, despite how silent everything was. But then, around midnight, the silence started to feel oppressive, almost like I was waiting for something to happen. I kept hearing sounds in the distance, something snapping in the trees, but every time I turned around, nothing was there. A raccoon? A deer? Something small? I kept telling myself it was nothing. By around 1 a.m., I was exhausted. I shut everything down, locked the RV, and crawled into bed. I remember thinking as I lay there, this is nice. Too quiet, but nice. My eyes closed, and I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up with a headache so intense it felt like someone had been drilling into my skull all night. It took me a second to focus on what was going on. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the fog out of my head, but it wasn't helping. Then I noticed it. The RV door was wide open. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't opened it. I'd locked it before going to bed. I was sure of it. But there it was, the door standing wide open, the cool night air rushing in, the dim light from the campfire casting long shadows into the RV. I didn't hear anything, no footsteps, no voices. The world outside was still. It was as if the entire campground was holding its breath. But the headache, it was like nothing I'd ever felt before. I could barely think straight. I sat up in bed, my legs feeling like jelly, my mind scrambling. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I'd just forgotten to lock the door. But the deeper I thought about it, the more I realized something wasn't right. I stumbled out of bed, dizziness hitting me in waves. The air inside the RV felt heavier than normal, like it had been closed up for too long. I moved toward the door, trying to shake off the dizziness. When I reached the door, I looked outside. The campground was still empty, the fire burning low. The RV's steps creaked under my weight as I took a step out onto the dirt. Everything seemed normal at first, but I felt like I was missing something important. I looked back at the RV, and that's when it hit me. I didn't remember the door opening, not once, not even a crack, and I definitely didn't leave it open. I went back inside, heart hammering. I checked everything. My wallet was missing. I was sure I'd left it on the counter next to the sink, but now it was gone. I checked the windows. They were all shut tight, the curtains still drawn. No one had broken in through the windows, but that still didn't explain the door. I started to feel like I was going insane. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone had been here while I slept. Maybe they had opened the door after I was knocked out. Knocked out. That's when I remembered the headache. I hadn't just woken up with a headache. It was like someone had drugged me, a sharp, foggy feeling in my brain that wasn't just from sleep. It felt chemical. Something was wrong. I ran my hand along the vent above my head. The air was warm. A terrible thought struck me. What if someone had pumped something into the RV to knock me out? I started checking every vent in the RV, touching them one by one, feeling the warmth seep through. It hit me that I'd never paid much attention to the ventilation before. There were no signs of a break-in, no marks on the door, no smashed windows. But what if someone had been inside, watching me while I slept? What if they'd opened the door after I was drugged? I walked around the RV again, my mind racing. My legs felt shaky, like I hadn't eaten in days, like I was about to pass out. But something was making my blood run cold, the feeling that I wasn't alone, the sensation that someone had been here. And it wasn't just the open door. That's when I found the small bag under the bed. At first, I thought it was mine, just some gear I'd forgotten about. But when I opened it, I froze. Inside were items I didn't recognize. Gloves, rope, a flashlight, a small knife, a bag that looked like it could fit a person's head in it. It was all too planned. This wasn't just a robbery. Someone had been preparing for something worse. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. I wasn't safe here. Whoever had been in my RV could still be nearby, watching. I grabbed my phone. No signal. Panic surged through me. I needed to get out. I ran to the RV's engine, praying it would start, but it sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. Whoever had been here had tampered with it. My legs felt weak, but I knew I had no choice. I had to run. I bolted out the door into the cold night with no clear direct, just away from the RV. My body was sluggish, my brain foggy from whatever they drugged me with, but I couldn't stop. I heard footsteps behind me, too quiet to pinpoint, but they were there. I could feel them. Whoever it was following me. I kept running, my heart pounding, sweat trickling down my forehead despite the chill. I had no idea how far I'd gone, or if I was even heading in the right direction. But then I saw headlights. A truck. I waved my arms like a maniac, and thank God they stopped. The driver helped me into the truck, and I was barely able to speak, my head still throbbing with that unrelenting pain. I tried to tell him what happened, but it was all jumbled. He just listened. Confused, but kind enough to take me to the nearest town. The police took my statement, but they didn't believe me. They said I was probably just disoriented, that I had overreacted to a simple break-in. They didn't find anything near the RV, no signs of a struggle, no footprints, nothing. I don't go camping alone anymore. The road into the Adirondacks was long, winding, and empty, just how I liked it. After a few hours of driving, I pulled the RV off the narrow trail and into a small clearing by the lake. The pines stretched high and thick around me, their dark green needles blending into the overcast sky. This was exactly what I needed, complete isolation. No people, no noise, just the quiet of the forest and the sound of my own thoughts. I parked the RV, turned off the engine, and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp with the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant ripple of water. Perfect. This place would give me the quiet I craved, a chance to think without the distractions of civilian life. Ever since leaving the military, I'd been chasing peace, and this felt like it could be the spot where I'd finally find it. I grabbed my gear and went about setting up camp. It didn't take long. I'd done this enough times to know the routine. Gather firewood, get a small fire going, and make sure the RV was ready for a night out in the wilderness. As I made my way through the trees, something caught my eye. On one of the nearby trunks, there was a strange marking, a crude carving of a figure, long and thin, etched into the bark. I frowned, running my fingers over it. Just a kid's prank, I figured, probably a bored hiker from weeks ago. But as I moved through the forest gathering wood, I found more of them. Carved figures on the trees, all tall and slender, stretching higher than any human could reach. It was strange, but I wasn't here to think about strange things. I was here to forget. By the time the sun set, the fire was crackling softly, casting flickering light across the clearing. I settled in next to the warmth, staring out at the darkening forest. There was a peace in the solitude, something comforting about being alone with the sounds of the wilderness. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. The forest was too quiet. No rustling leaves, no night animals scurrying about, just silence. And then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. I shook my head. "You're just on edge," I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the tension building in my chest. The wilderness could play tricks on you if you let it. I knew that better than most. I was here to clear my head, not to let it run wild. But then I saw it. At the edge of my vision, just for a split second, something moved. Tall, thin, just beyond the trees. I jumped to my feet, gripping the flashlight tighter, and aimed the beam toward where I'd seen the figure. But there was nothing, only the dark outline of the pines swaying slightly in the wind. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, every muscle tense, waiting for something to step out of the shadows. But after a long moment, the rustling stopped, the trees swayed, and the forest fell back into its unsettling quiet. I forced myself to sit back down, staring into the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The next morning, I woke early, determined to shake off the nerves from the night before. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike deeper into the woods. Maybe if I put some distance between myself and the campsite, I could clear my head. The trail was faint, barely more than a thin path winding through the trees. As I walked, I found more of the carvings on the trees, each one stranger than the last. They were everywhere, slender, elongated figures with no faces, all staring outward, all watching. The forest felt darker here, the canopy thick enough that the sunlight barely broke through. About an hour in, I reached a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was stunning. Endless trees stretching out below, the mountains rising in the distance. I was about to pull out my camera when I heard footsteps behind me. "Morning," a voice said. I turned to see an older man, probably in his 60s, standing a few feet away. He was holding a bundle of firewood in his arms, his face weathered and sun-creased like someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, giving him a nod. "Not many people come this deep into the forest," the man replied, his voice low and rough. He looked me up and down, then glanced toward the valley. "You camping nearby?" "Yeah, just over by the lake. Trying to get some quiet." He gave me a long look, his expression unreadable. "You should be careful. This part of the Alder Andax, it's different." "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He glanced around, his eyes flicking nervously toward the trees. "There's something in these woods. People call it the Watcher. It stays deep in the forest, watching from the shadows. You see it once, and you'll start seeing it everywhere." I laughed, shaking my head. "Local ghost stories." The man didn't smile. "It's not a story. It's real. People who see the Watcher, they don't come back the same." He took a step closer. "I'm telling you this because you look like you've seen things. You know when something's not right, and something's not right here." I met his gaze, feeling that familiar knot of unease tightening in my gut. "What do you mean?" "You'll know when it's close. You'll hear it first, and then you'll feel it." He turned, starting back down the trail. "Just don't stay too long." I watched him go, his words echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as superstition, but the way he'd looked at me, like he'd seen the same thing I had last night, made it hard to dismiss. That evening, back at camp, the unease was worse. The forest felt like it was closing in, the trees towering higher than I remembered, the shadows deeper, darker. The wind had picked up, making the fire flicker and sputter, but it didn't drown out the sounds. The rustling came back, louder this time, and with it something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the darkness, but the beam barely seemed to penetrate the trees. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit them, but when I moved the beam, they started again. I stood, turning in a slow circle, the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. My pulse was pounding, adrenaline kicking in. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone out here. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. And then, just beyond the firelight, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing between the trees. Its body was almost skeletal, its limbs too long, its head bent slightly as if it were watching me from above. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow, dark pits that stared right at me. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking despite myself. The figure didn't respond. It stayed still, silent, its form almost blending into the shadows. I raised my knife, backing toward the RV. The figure remained at the edge of the light, watching, waiting. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. For hours, I sat by the window, knife in hand, waiting for the figure to move. But it never did. It just stood there, barely visible in the darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on the RV. At dawn, the figure was gone, but the carvings had multiplied, dozens of them surrounding the campsite. The same tall, thin figures etched into the trees like a silent army. I didn't waste time. I packed up everything, threw it into the RV, and started the engine. As I drove away, the carvings seemed to watch me, following me down the narrow trail, their hollow eyes staring. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the area, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as the trees thinned and the road stretched out in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the watcher was still out there, somewhere in those woods. It was still watching, and maybe it always would be. I pulled the RV off the narrow, dusty road and into the shadow of Dead Man's Gulch. The engine sputtered to a stop, and for a moment I sat there in silence, staring out at the barren valley stretching before me. The Ruby Mountains loomed in the distance, jagged and dark against the fading light. This was exactly what I wanted: isolation, quiet, and a place where the world couldn't find me. The RV had become my escape after Laura died. I could roam wherever I wanted, park wherever I pleased, and it felt like a kind of freedom. But now, sitting here in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The place had a weight to it, like the air was thick with something unseen, something waiting. I climbed out of the RV and stretched, the dry desert air biting at my skin as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. Dead Man's Gulch was as desolate as it sounded. I had read about it in a ghost stories book I found at a thrift store. Some legend about miners who disappeared back in the late 1800s. They supposedly saw shadowy figures in the valley at night before the earth collapsed and swallowed them whole. I didn't believe in ghosts, cryptids, or any of the nonsense locals spouted about this place. I just wanted to be alone, away from the pitying glances and endless condolences. No one understood how grief gnawed at you, hollowing you out until nothing was left. Setting up camp took about 15 minutes. I parked the RV next to the remnants of an old mining camp. A few rusted-out carts, the skeletal remains of a cabin, and a collapsed mine shaft disappearing into the hillside. It was perfect. No people, no distractions. Just me, the desert, and the stars. By the time I finished dinner, canned chili, nothing fancy, the sun had dipped below the horizon. I sat at the small table inside the RV, staring at the book in front of me, filled with old tales of ghost sightings and strange disappearances, most of them from around here. The locals called it the Phantom of the Mines, a shadowy creature that haunted the valleys, stalking anyone who got too close to the abandoned shafts. I flipped through the pages, skimming over accounts of miners swearing they'd seen something dark moving in the fog just before disaster struck. I shook my head and closed the book. Ghosts, shadows. It was all nonsense. Laura would have laughed at the idea. She'd never been scared of anything. Not the woods, not the wild. She was fearless. But I wasn't Laura. As I cleaned up, the RV's lights flickered. I paused, glancing at the ceiling. The lights steadied again, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just a glitch, I told myself. The RV was old. Things broke. But the air suddenly felt colder. When I glanced out the window, I swore I saw movement, something shifting in the darkness just beyond the headlights. I stepped outside, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound. The night was still. Too still. The kind of quiet that presses down on you. I scanned the area, the beam from my flashlight cutting through the shadows. Nothing moved. Just rocks, dirt, and the skeletal remains of the old mining camp. Then I heard it. Faint. Like the sound of gravel shifting underfoot, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. "Get a grip, Jake," I muttered. "It's just the wind." I turned back toward the RV, ready to call it a night, until I saw them. Handprints. Long streaks of dust trailing down the windows, as if someone or something had dragged their fingers across the glass. My heart skipped a beat. I was alone. I knew that. No one had passed me on the road for hours. No one was out here. At least, no one should have been. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The RV felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the wind outside picked up, howling through the narrow canyon. I sat at the table, staring at the window, waiting, but nothing happened. The next morning, the RV was completely dead. No power, no lights, no water pump, nothing. I checked the battery. It was completely drained. It didn't make sense. I had it checked before I left. It was supposed to last for weeks. Frustrated, I spent most of the day trying to figure out what was wrong, but everything seemed fine. The battery had just died. By late afternoon, I gave up. I was stuck here for the night. I cursed under my breath. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just bad luck. I decided to go for a walk, maybe clear my head. The old mine shaft loomed in the distance, and I made my way toward it. The ground was hard and cracked, littered with strange deep marks crisscrossing the dirt. They looked like they'd been dragged by something large. Too large. At the mine's entrance, the air was cooler, thick with the smell of dust and rot. The opening had collapsed years ago, the rocks jagged and sharp. But there, in the dirt, were more of those strange marks, long, deep gouges, like something had been clawing its way out. I backed away, chest tightening. It was just a mine, just old rocks and dirt. But as I turned to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving at the edge of the rocks. I whipped around, nothing. I ran back to the RV, heart pounding. That night, the first knock came just after midnight, a loud, deliberate bang on the side of the RV. I shot up, grabbing the shotgun by my bed. My hands shook as I loaded it. Another bang, closer this time. "Who's there?" I shouted, voice cracking. No answer, just the sound of gravel shifting. I grabbed the flashlight and threw open the door. The cold hit me hard. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing. No one. But then I saw it. A dark, shifting figure at the edge of the rocks. Its form flickered like smoke in the wind. It didn't have a face, but I felt its eyes on me. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast echoed, but the thing didn't move. It just faded. I stumbled back inside, locking the door. The lights flickered and then went dark. I sat in total blackness, shotgun in my lap, waiting. But it didn't come back. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed up and climbed into the driver's seat. Miraculously, the RV started like nothing had been wrong. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, speeding away from Dead Man's Gulch. The weight in the air lifted, the fog was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling I had narrowly escaped something dark, something still waiting in those mines. And as I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, just in case. My name's Ronald Lopez, and this happened back in 1996 in the thick pine stretches of Idaho's Payette National Forest. Now, I'm not some storytelling type, but when you've seen what I've seen, it sits with you whether you want it to or not. I've been with the Forest Service nearly a decade, mostly search and rescue, but I don't really get a thrill out of finding folks lost off the trails. It's just a job, you know? Pays the bills and keeps my folks from worrying too much. But this wasn't a typical day at work. The call came in just past noon. 2 teenagers had gone missing around Lake Cascade while hiking, and their mom swore up and down that they wouldn't have wandered off the marked trails. Typical, I thought. Parents always claim their kids are not the type to take risks, and they end up climbing a cliffside or venturing miles off the paths. I radioed in, grabbed my pack, and met up with my buddy Matt Taylor at the ranger station. We'd handled plenty of search missions together, so we had our system down pat. By the time we started the hike, the sun was a half-hearted glow behind thick clouds, casting a dim grayness over the woods. We headed up the main trail, our boots crunching over the underbrush and fallen pine needles. I remember making some wisecrack about the kids probably sitting by the lake with no cell signal, blissfully unaware of the mini panic they'd sparked. Matt chuckled and responded with something about making up for our overtime with the stash of cold beers back at the station. Just another day on the job, so I thought. It wasn't long before we hit signs of trouble. About a mile up, we found what looked like a small campsite. A few scattered granola bar wrappers, a disposable camera, and a dirty sweatshirt lying next to a patch of trampled ferns. But there was something off about the setup. It didn't feel like kids were lounging around here. It felt more like someone had run through. The air was heavy, and I could smell this rank, earthy stench that was wrong for the forest. Matt raised an eyebrow at me, like he was feeling it too. We called out a few times, half expecting the teens to stumble out of the bushes, embarrassed and red-faced, but nothing stirred except a few startled birds in that eerie silence that fills the gaps where sounds should be. I knelt down, trying to get a sense of what had gone down here. There was a sharp imprint in the dirt, something like a claw mark, but wider and deeper than any animal I'd seen in these woods. I brushed my fingers over it, feeling the jagged lines. Whatever made that wasn't anything natural. "You seeing this?" I asked. Matt had spotted something farther up, a chunk of what looked like torn fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. It was a piece of a t-shirt, stained dark, likely blood. I felt a chill settle over me then, a realization that whatever was out here wasn't just a wild animal. We both knew when to trust our gut, and my gut was screaming that we were in over our heads. We pressed on, calling their names, but now every rustle in the bushes had me glancing over my shoulder. About a mile deeper into the woods, we found the first body. It was one of the teens, a boy, face down with his arm twisted under him at an unnatural angle. His body was mangled in a way that no mountain lion or bear would have done. His torso was scratched open, not by claws, but by something else, something that seemed to tear rather than slash. Matt stepped back, a grimace on his face, muttering something I didn't quite catch. We checked for signs of life, even though it was obvious we'd be wasting our time. He was gone. Worse yet, the terror etched onto his face told us this was no accident, no animal mishap. It was a hunt. We radioed back to the station, giving as calm a report as we could manage. They told us to stay put. Backup was on the way. But Matt and I exchanged a look. Sitting still in the woods with God knows what lurking around? Not likely. We agreed to find higher ground and keep watch until help arrived, but something told me that wouldn't be enough. Just as we started back toward a nearby ridge, we heard a faint sound, a low, uneven clicking, like stones scraping together. It was rhythmic and unnatural, like it had intent behind it. Matt raised his flashlight, sweeping it in a wide arc. I followed his beam, and for a moment we saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, between two thick pines, a shape appeared. It was unlike anything I'd seen, like a mix between a lizard and something much larger. It moved low to the ground, with a long, scaly body and limbs that looked almost human in shape, though bent and twisted in a way that no human could ever walk. Its skin was dark and rough, patched with what looked like scales. But the strangest part was its head, elongated with a wide, flat mouth and jagged rows of what I can only describe as crocodile-like teeth. Matt and I froze. The thing paused, raising its head as if it sensed us. Then, with a sharp hiss, it lunged forward. I didn't have time to think. My instincts took over, and I yanked Matt to the side just as it shot past us, swiping the air with a clawed arm. We bolted up the ridge, tripping over roots and rocks in our haste. But it was on us, relentless, snapping its jaws and thrashing the underbrush with every step. I remember yelling at Matt to split off, hoping to confuse it or at least buy us some time. He hesitated, but the look on my face must have convinced him, and he veered off to the left. I dove to the right, dodging trees and scrambling up a small incline. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the forest, tearing at anything in its path. There was no mercy, no pause. It was like it had locked onto us, hungry and unyielding. I lost track of Matt in the chaos, my mind racing as I looked for any place to hide. I spotted a small crevice between two rocks and dove in, pressing myself flat against the earth, hoping it would lose my scent. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of Matt's scream cutting through the forest. It was short, choked off, and I knew he'd met the same fate as the teenager back at the campsite. The clicking sound grew fainter, and I dared to lift my head. My legs were numb, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. But the forest around me was silent again. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, watching the trees, waiting for any sign of movement. When I was sure it was safe, I crawled out, my legs unsteady, and started the long trek back to the station alone. When I returned to the ranger station, the backup was just arriving. They looked at me like I'd gone mad when I tried to explain what happened. They asked about Matt, and I told them the truth, as much as they would believe. We went back out to search, but we only found remnants, torn pieces of clothing, broken branches, and drag marks leading deeper into the forest. No sign of Matt, no bodies, nothing to prove what we'd seen except my own word. Months later, I did some digging, trying to find any hint of what that creature was. Local legends spoke of a predator, something that roamed these woods centuries ago, rumored to be a guardian or a curse, depending on who you asked. They called it the Leshy, a name whispered by those who claimed to have seen it before vanishing into the wilderness. They said it only showed itself to those who dared to encroach on its territory too far, too boldly, as if it needed to remind us that we were still trespassers here. That creature, it wasn't just hunting, it was sending a message loud and clear. My name is Brian Patel, and back in 2016, I found myself deep in the heart of Montana's Glacier National Park. I'd always been an outdoor enthusiast, spending my weekends hiking trails and exploring the wilderness. That summer, my buddy Trevor and I decided to tackle the Highline Trail, a 15-mile trek known for its stunning vistas and challenging terrain. We arrived at the park early in the morning, the sun just beginning to cast a warm glow over the rugged mountains. Trevor cracked a joke about us being the next Granite Grizzlies, a nickname we'd given ourselves after one too many camping trips. I laughed, adjusting my backpack. If we see any actual grizzlies, you can be the one to hug them, I shot back. As we set off, the trail was everything we hoped for, towering cliffs on one side and sheer drops on the other. We passed a few fellow hikers, sharing nods and smiles. One older gentleman warned us about loose rocks ahead. "Thanks for the heads up," Trevor replied. "We'll make sure not to lose our footing. Gravity's got enough victims already." About 5 miles in, we reached a fork in the path. The main trail continued forward, but a narrower, less trodden path veered off to the left. A weathered sign pointed left, labeled Swift Creek Overlook. Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Feel like taking the road less traveled?" "Why not?" I shrugged. "Could be an adventure. Besides, maybe we'll find that pot of gold everyone's always talking about." We turned onto the smaller trail, and the atmosphere subtly shifted. The sounds of distant hikers faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The canopy overhead grew denser, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. After another mile, we stumbled upon an abandoned ranger station. It was a small, rustic cabin with a collapsed porch and windows clouded by dust and time. "Looks like fixer-upper material," Trevor quipped. "Think they'd mind if we moved in?" "Sure," I said, "as long as you're okay with the wildlife roommates. Rent's probably cheap." Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to take a quick look inside. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, carrying hints of mildew and aged wood. A desk sat against one wall, papers strewn across it as if someone had left in a hurry. Trevor picked up a faded photograph from the desk. It showed a group of rangers posing proudly in front of the very cabin we stood in. "Wonder what happened here," he mused. "Maybe they got tired of the decor," I suggested. "Or perhaps the commute was killer." As we left the cabin, I noticed something odd. A series of deep scratches gouged into the wooden exterior, almost like claw marks. I pointed them out to Trevor. "Think we've got a big cat around?" He examined the marks. "Could be. Mountain lions are known to roam these parts. Adds a little excitement, don't you think?" "Just what I needed," I said. "A reason to keep my head on a swivel." We continued along the trail, which grew narrower and more overgrown. The underbrush thickened, and the sounds of wildlife became more pronounced. Birds chirped intermittently, and the distant call of an unknown animal echoed through the trees. "Ever feel like you're being watched?" Trevor asked, only half joking. "All the time. It's my natural charisma," I replied with a smirk. We reached a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a breathtaking view of a waterfall, cascading into a crystalline pool below. "Now that's worth the hike," I said. Trevor was about to respond when he froze, his eyes fixed on something across the clearing. Did you see that? See what? I followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. I thought I saw movement, something big. Maybe it's your ego manifesting physically, I teased. He chuckled nervously. Yeah, maybe. We decided to take a short break, sitting on a fallen log and munching on trail mix. I pulled out my map to check our location. According to this, the Swift Creek overlook should be just ahead. Great, Trevor said. I can't wait to update my social media with some envy-inducing photos. As we packed up to leave, a sudden rustling in the bushes behind us made us both turn sharply. A deer burst out, darting across the clearing at breakneck speed. Guess we're not the only ones enjoying the great outdoors, I said. But then we heard another sound, a low guttural noise that defied easy description. It was unlike any animal call I'd ever heard. What was that? Trevor whispered. I shook my head. Probably just the wind, or your stomach complaining about that gas station burrito. He didn't laugh. Maybe we should head back. Come on, we're almost to the overlook. Don't tell me you're scared. He hesitated, but then nodded. All right, but let's keep moving. We pressed on, but the forest seemed to grow darker despite the still high sun. The trees towered over us, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The path was barely visible now, more of a suggestion than a trail. Another sound pierced the silence, a snapping branch, closer this time. We both stopped. Brian, maybe we should turn around, Trevor said, his voice tense. All right. Maybe this was a bad idea, I admitted. We started back the way we came, picking up our pace. The forest, which had felt so welcoming earlier, now seemed oppressive. Every shadow looked like it was concealing something. Suddenly, Trevor tripped and fell hard. I rushed to help him up. You okay? Yeah, just twisted my ankle, I think. Can you walk? He tested his weight. It's not great, but I can manage. As we resumed our hurried retreat, a chilling howl echoed through the trees. It was close, too close. That's no mountain lion, I said quietly. Keep moving, Trevor urged. We broke into a limping jog. The path was nearly impossible to follow, and in our panic, we veered off into uncharted territory. Without warning, a massive figure burst from the foliage, blocking our path. It stood on all fours, covered in thick, matted fur. Its body was like that of a wolf, but far larger, easily the size of a bear. Saliva dripped from its maw, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Run, I shouted. We bolted in the opposite direction, adrenaline overriding Trevor's injury. The creature let out a bone-chilling snarl and gave chase. Dodging trees and leaping over roots, we ran blindly through the forest. Behind us, the thunderous footsteps of the beast grew louder. I could hear its heavy breathing, feel the ground shake with each stride. Trevor stumbled again, and this time the creature was upon him before I could react. It swiped at him with a massive paw, sending him crashing into a tree. Blood spattered across the leaves. Trevor, I screamed. I looked around frantically for anything to use as a weapon. Spotting a broken branch, I grabbed it and swung at the beast. The makeshift club struck its side, but seemed to do little more than annoy it. The creature turned its attention to me, its eyes locking onto mine. In a desperate bid, I threw a rock at its head. It flinched, giving me a split second to act. I rushed to Trevor's side. He was conscious but badly injured. We have to go, I urged. He grimaced. I can't. You have to get out of here. Not a chance, I said, hoisting him up. The beast shook off its momentary distraction and advanced slowly, almost as if savoring the hunt. Thinking quickly, I remembered the flare gun in my backpack, a safety measure I'd almost forgotten. I yanked it out, aimed at the creature, and fired. The flare struck its shoulder, erupting in a burst of light and sparks. The beast recoiled, letting out a pained howl. Seizing the opportunity, I half-dragged, half-carried Trevor as we made a desperate escape. We stumbled upon a narrow ravine, a gap too wide to jump, but with a fallen log bridging the sides. Go, Trevor urged. Together, we scrambled across the log. Midway, the beast reappeared at the ravine's edge, eyes glowing with fury. It started across the log behind us. Once we reached the other side, I pulled out a lighter from my pocket. Keep going, I yelled to Trevor. I set fire to the dry brush at our end of the log. Flames licked up the wood just as the creature was halfway across. It hesitated, but its momentum carried it forward. The fire weakened the log's structure, and with a loud crack, it snapped. The beast plunged into the ravine below, disappearing into the darkness. Breathing heavily, we didn't wait to see if it would resurface. We pushed onward until we broke through the tree line and stumbled onto a park ranger station. This one occupied. The rangers sprang into action upon seeing us. "What happened?" one demanded. "Some kind of animal attacked us," I managed to say between gasps. They called for medical assistance and alerted their teams. Trevor was taken to a nearby hospital, and I accompanied him in the ambulance. In the following days, park officials searched the area but found no trace of the creature. They did, however, discover remains from hikers reported missing over the past year. The authorities speculated about a rogue bear, but I knew that wasn't the case. Trevor underwent surgery but pulled through. When I visited him, he tried to lighten the mood. "Guess we won't be making the cover of Outdoor Magazine after all," he joked weakly. "Maybe not," I replied, "but we've got one heck of a story to tell." In the aftermath, the park officials decided to close off the Swift Creek Overlook Trail indefinitely. They cited unsafe conditions and potential wildlife hazards. As for the creature, theories abounded. A previously unknown species, a misidentified bear, even whispers of local legends come to life. Whatever it was, it remained a mystery. The experience didn't deter me from the outdoors, but it did teach me a valuable lesson about respecting the unpredictability of nature. My name's Dylan Gonzalez, and in 2013, I took my RV to a spot near Kenai Fjords National Park in Alaska. I'm not a survivalist or a wilderness guide. I'm an accountant from Atlanta who got fed up with numbers and paperwork. So I figured I'd finally hit pause on life and spend a couple of weeks camping. I drove all the way from Georgia, chasing the quiet, thinking Alaska would be the kind of place where I could just sit back with a beer and let my brain go blank for a while. When I parked the RV in this isolated area just outside the national park, it felt perfect. Not a single person around. I was miles from the nearest campground, let alone a neighbor. And to me, that was ideal. I was setting up my little oasis when I noticed a couple of things off the bat that didn't sit right. The first was the absence of wildlife. I mean, it's Alaska, bears, moose, the whole lot. But around me, nothing. No scat on the ground, no broken branches from animals passing by, just silence, except for the faint rustling of leaves. By day 3, I'd settled into a good routine. Coffee in the morning, a short hike in the woods, then I'd grill up whatever canned meal I felt like eating. It was on one of these afternoon hikes that I stumbled across an old, half-collapsed wooden cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The door was hanging off the hinges, and there was this strange smell around it. A mix of rotting wood and something sharper, kind of metallic. I figured it was rust from some old tool or metal scrap inside, so I brushed it off. But something didn't sit right with me. There were bits of clothing scattered around the area. Shirts, old jackets, even a pair of jeans. Looked like they'd been there for years, frayed and faded by the weather. I don't know why, but I felt a chill. Part of me thought I should turn back, but another part, maybe the accountant side that just needs answers, thought I should go inside and take a look around. The interior was even worse. Dirt was caked on every surface. The floor was covered in what looked like animal bones, small ones, maybe birds or rabbits. And that same metallic smell was stronger now. I looked up and noticed something hanging from the ceiling. It was a hook, the kind you'd see in butcher shops. It didn't belong there, not in the middle of a forest. But it was there all the same, swaying slightly as if disturbed by some breeze that I couldn't feel. At that point, I decided to head back to the RV. I figured it was best to keep my distance from whatever strange things were left behind in that place. But when I stepped out of the cabin, I could have sworn I heard footsteps, faint and dragging behind me. I stopped, turned around, and waited. But nothing appeared. The forest around me was dead silent again. Back at the RV, I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I just psyched myself out. That night, though, I barely slept. I had brought a shotgun with me just in case of wildlife, and I kept it by my side. Every little noise outside felt amplified, like something was creeping around just out of sight. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Morning came, and I felt a bit stupid. I decided to spend the day fishing in a small creek I'd passed earlier, trying to distract myself. But even out by the water, that eerie silence remained. No birds chirping, no fish biting, just the occasional snap of a twig somewhere behind me, which I tried my best to ignore. The thought that maybe I wasn't alone out here crept up more than once, and I started questioning if maybe I'd made a mistake coming out this far. Then, later that evening, as I was grilling up some fish, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, just on the edge of the tree line. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing, but all I could make out was a figure. A man, maybe, crouching low, watching me. He was dressed in what looked like layers upon layers of dirty clothes, all torn up and mud-streaked, his face partially obscured by a tangle of hair. He was still as a statue, just watching. I shouted out to him, trying to play it cool, asking if he was lost, but he didn't respond. Instead, he slowly ducked back into the trees, disappearing without a sound. Every instinct told me I needed to pack up and leave. But stubborn as I was, I convinced myself that he was probably just some harmless drifter. I thought if I ignored him, he'd go away. The next night, things escalated. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a scraping noise coming from outside. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something was being pulled along the side of the RV. I froze, gripping the shotgun tighter than ever, listening. The scraping moved along the length of the vehicle, stopping right outside the window next to my bed. I didn't dare look out. For a solid hour, I just lay there, sweating, listening to the faint scratching on the metal. Then, silence. I finally drifted off, hoping I'd imagined the whole thing. But in the morning, when I stepped outside, there were muddy handprints smeared along the side of the RV. That was enough for me. I started packing up my stuff, thinking I'd head back to the main road and find a new spot, maybe closer to a town. But as I loaded the last of my things, I spotted him again, standing a few yards away by a cluster of birch trees, staring at me with this blank, almost curious expression. He was holding a long, rusty blade, one that looked like it had seen far too much use, and his clothes were even filthier than before. I didn't think. I raised the shotgun and aimed at him, shouting for him to stay back. He just smiled, a slow, unsettling grin, and started to walk toward me, dragging that blade along the ground. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping he'd take the hint. But he kept coming, unfazed, picking up speed. At that moment, I knew I couldn't just wait around. I ran back into the RV, locked the door, and fired up the engine. But the man lunged at the driver's side window, slamming his fist against it, that rusty blade scraping along the glass. I stomped on the gas, swerving as he clung to the side, banging on the window, his face pressed against it with that same terrifying smile. The RV lurched forward, finally throwing him off balance, and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. After what felt like an eternity, I hit the highway, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away, where I could finally breathe. The police in Anchorage were polite but skeptical. They took down my statement and checked out the muddy handprints on the RV, but all they could offer was a half-hearted promise to patrol the area. They didn't even sound like they believed me. Later, out of curiosity, or maybe just out of fear, I did some digging. I found a couple of stories about a man named Gideon, who was known to lurk in those woods. Rumored to be some kind of deranged hermit who'd lived there for decades, people said he'd lost his family in a hunting accident and went off the deep end, becoming obsessed with cleansing the forest of outsiders. My name is Alexander Wagner, and I'm 33 years old. I'm a wildlife biologist and an avid camper. I've always preferred the solitude of the woods to the chaos of city life. But what happened to me last October in Shade State Park changed the way I look at the wilderness forever. I wasn't just alone out there. I was being hunted. I'd just gone through a messy breakup and needed an escape. Shade State Park seemed like the perfect place to clear my head and refocus on my work. I had an article deadline looming about the biodiversity in Indiana state parks, and I figured a few nights in the woods would give me the peace I needed to write. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, parking my RV in one of the more secluded campsites near the edge of the park. The spot was surrounded by tall trees, their leaves starting to turn shades of orange and gold. A narrow ravine cut through the area, and the soft gurgle of a distant creek was the only sound as I set up my gear. I realized I'd forgotten to pack extra batteries for my flashlight. Amateur mistake, I muttered to myself. Still, I shrugged it off, figuring my phone's light would suffice if needed. I was more concerned about the thick fog rolling in. It clung to the ground, making the woods feel unnervingly still. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it for the first time, faint crying drifting through the trees. It sounded like a child, soft and pitiful. I froze, listening, my heart pounding. It wasn't unusual to hear strange noises in the woods, but this was different. The sound tugged at something deep inside me, like an instinct I couldn't ignore. "Hello?" I called, standing and shining my phone's light into the trees. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence behind. My gut told me to stay put, but I couldn't shake the nagging thought that someone might need help. Grabbing my phone and a jacket, I ventured a few steps into the woods. "Is someone there?" I called again, my voice trembling. No answer, just the rustling of leaves as a light breeze picked up. After a few minutes of searching, I gave up and headed back to the RV, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. The next morning, I met Ranger Neil. He was making his rounds and stopped by my campsite to chat. He was in his 40s with a weathered face and a calm demeanor. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "You out here all alone?" "Yeah," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "I'm a biologist doing some research." "Ah, well, be careful," he said, glancing at the fog still clinging to the trees. "Shade's got its quirks. Folks around here like to tell stories about the Crying Woods." I raised an eyebrow. "The Crying Woods?" "Old legend," he said, leaning on his truck. "Back in the 30s, a little girl went missing out here. Family never found her. Some say you can still hear her crying, trying to lead people into the woods. Thing is, those who follow the sound don't always come back." I laughed nervously. "That's unsettling." Neil gave me a long, serious look. "Just stay on the trails, all right?" I nodded, but his words stuck with me. That day, I decided to explore a few trails and take notes for my article. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, full of vibrant colors and the earthy smell of fallen leaves. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About an hour into my hike, I noticed footprints on the trail. They were small, like a child's, and barefoot. I stopped, frowning. What kind of parent lets their kid wander around here without shoes? The prints veered off the trail, disappearing into the dense underbrush. I crouched down to take a closer look. The edges of the prints were fresh, the soil still slightly damp. A chill ran down my spine. I stood quickly, deciding it was time to head back to the RV. That night, the crying returned. It started softly, just beyond the edge of the campsite. This time, it didn't stop when I called out. Instead, it grew louder, more desperate. "Help me," a small voice whimpered. My heart raced as I peered out the RV window. In the dim firelight, I saw her, a girl no older than 8, standing at the edge of the trees. She was barefoot, wearing a dirty white dress, her hair tangled and wild. She was crying, her shoulders shaking. "Hey," I called, grabbing my jacket. "Are you okay?" The girl looked up, and for a moment our eyes met. Her face was pale, her cheeks streaked with tears, but her eyes, they were hollow, dark as the void. Before I could react, she turned and ran into the woods. "Wait!" I shouted, chasing after her. The fog swallowed me as I stumbled through the trees, calling for the girl. The crying grew fainter, pulling me deeper and deeper into the woods. My phone's light barely cut through the haze, and the trees seemed to close in around me. Finally, I stopped, gasping for breath. The crying had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I turned in a slow circle, realizing I had no idea where I was. My stomach sank. Then I saw it, a small, crumbling cabin hidden among the trees. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and the windows were broken. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity won out. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and decay. Dust motes floated in the dim light as I stepped over broken furniture and shattered glass. On a table in the corner, I found a stack of old newspapers, yellowed with age. My breath caught as I read the headline, "Local Girl Missing in Shade State Park." The date was from 1937. Beneath the article was a photograph of the girl. It was her, the same girl I'd seen in the woods. As I skimmed the article, a detail jumped out at me. The girl had been suspected of pushing her younger brother into a ravine shortly before her disappearance. She claimed it was an accident, but witnesses reported hearing the siblings arguing moments before the tragedy. A sudden sound made me whirl around. The crying had returned, louder now, echoing through the cabin. My hands shook as I backed toward the door. When I stepped outside, the girl was there, standing at the edge of the ravine. Her crying stopped as she turned to face me. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered, her voice laced with anger. "I didn't," I stammered, my throat dry. "I'm here to help." She took a step closer, and her face twisted. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Her eyes began to bleed, dark streaks running down her pale cheeks. "You'll stay with me," she said, her voice a distorted growl. The ground beneath me trembled, and I realized too late that I was standing at the edge of the ravine. Roots and dirt crumbled under my feet as the girl lunged at me, her hands clawing at my arms. I screamed, swinging my phone at her. The light catching her face, she recoiled, hissing like an animal, and vanished into the fog. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the forest floor, shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. The walk was a blur, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. When I finally locked myself inside, I collapsed onto the bed, clutching my knees to my chest. As I drove out of the park the next morning, I heard the crying one last time, faint and distant. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing in the road, watching me leave. I haven't gone back to Shade State Park since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear a child crying outside my window, and I know she's still waiting for me. This story highlights the chilling lure of a malevolent spirit preying on empathy and curiosity to trap its victims. I woke up that morning with a sense of unease. Something about the quiet was off. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes your heart pound a little harder. My name's Gregory, and I'd driven out to the middle of nowhere in an RV hoping to get some peace and quiet. Life had been a series of endless loops, a carousel of monotony that I desperately needed to step off. The campsite was perfect, nestled in the thick woods of northern Michigan. It was isolated enough that you couldn't hear any traffic, just the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves. I had my chair set up by the fire pit, and the coffee was brewing on the small stove inside the RV. My routine started with a morning hike. The path I'd chosen was well-trodden but still wild, the kind where you could easily believe you were the first person to step foot there in years. As I wandered deeper into the forest, the sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air was fresh with that earthy smell that only a forest can have. I was about an hour into my hike when I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. It was the kind of place you see in horror movies, but there was something oddly compelling about it. The door hung off its hinges, and the windows were shattered, giving it a skeletal look. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The inside of the cabin was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Old furniture was strewn about, and papers littered the floor. I bent down to pick up a yellowed piece of paper, which seemed to be a letter. It was hard to make out the faded ink, but the words "help" and "trapped" were unmistakable. Suddenly, a noise from outside caught my attention. It was a low rustling, like something or someone was moving through the underbrush. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I quickly stuffed the letter into my pocket. Stepping outside, I looked around but saw nothing. The forest was eerily quiet again. I decided it was time to head back to the RV. The uneasy feeling had returned, stronger than before. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sped up my pace, eager to get back to the safety of my campsite. When I arrived, I found the RV door slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. My heart pounded in my chest as I cautiously stepped inside. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed the coffee pot was smashed on the floor and the contents of my backpack were scattered around. Someone had been here. I grabbed the hunting knife I always kept in the RV and stepped back outside, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The woods around me seemed to close in, the trees looming like silent sentinels. That's when I saw him, a man standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. He was tall and gaunt, with wild hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. His clothes were tattered, and his eyes were fixed on me with a disturbing intensity. "Who are you?" I shouted, gripping the knife tighter. He didn't respond, just stood there staring. Then, slowly, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I felt a surge of anger and fear. Who the hell was this guy, and what did he want? I wasn't about to let some creep ruin my escape from reality. I decided to follow him, keeping my distance, but staying close enough to keep him in sight. The man moved quickly through the forest, almost as if he knew it, like the back of his hand. I struggled to keep up, branches slapping against my face and thorns scratching my arms. After what felt like hours, we arrived at another clearing, this one dominated by a large, ominous-looking structure. It was an old warehouse, abandoned and overgrown with ivy. The man slipped inside through a broken window, and I cautiously followed. The interior of the warehouse was dark and musty. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. I could hear the sound of footsteps echoing off the walls. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw him again, standing at the far end of the room. "Why are you following me?" he asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I should be asking you the same thing," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "What do you want from me?" He let out a low, humorless laugh. "You shouldn't have come here. This place isn't for people like you." I felt a surge of defiance. "And what exactly is this place?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked deeper into the warehouse. I hesitated for a moment before following him. We navigated through a maze of corridors and rooms, each one more dilapidated than the last. Finally, we arrived at a large open space that seemed to be some sort of makeshift living quarters. There were makeshift beds, old furniture, and even a small stove. "Welcome to my home," he said with a hint of sarcasm. "I've been living here for years." "Ever since I disappeared," he added. "Disappeared?" I asked, confused. "Yeah, disappeared, like all those people you read about in the papers. Just vanished without a trace. Only I didn't vanish. I chose to live off the grid, away from society." I started to piece it together. This guy was one of those missing persons you hear about on the news, the ones who vanish and are never found. But he had chosen this life for reasons I couldn't understand. "Why?" I asked. "Why live like this?" He looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Because society is broken. People are selfish, cruel, and deceitful. Out here, I'm free. I don't have to answer to anyone." "But you're not free," I argued. "You're trapped here, just like that letter said." His eyes flashed with anger. "You read the letter?" "Yeah, I did. Someone was asking for help." "Who was it?" He laughed again, a harsh, bitter sound. "That was me, a long time ago. I thought I wanted to be found, but then I realized I was better off alone." I felt a chill run through me. This guy was clearly unhinged. I needed to get out of there, and fast. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'll just go, and we can both pretend this never happened." He shook his head. "I can't let you do that. You know too much." Before I could react, he lunged at me, knocking the knife out of my hand. We struggled, rolling across the dirty floor. He was stronger than he looked, and I was quickly overpowered. He pinned me down, his hand closing around my throat. I gasped for air, my vision starting to blur. In a desperate move, I reached for a nearby piece of broken glass and slashed at his arm. He screamed in pain and released his grip. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the knife and running for the exit. I could hear him behind me, cursing and stumbling. I burst out of the warehouse and into the forest, running as fast as I could. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I broke through the trees and into the clearing where my RV was parked. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hand shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. There's a man. He's trying to kill me, I gasped. Stay calm, sir. Where are you? I gave them my location, praying they would get here in time. I could hear the man outside banging on the door and shouting. I grabbed the hunting rifle I kept in the RV, loading it with trembling hands. The banging stopped and everything went silent. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes felt like hours. Then I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me as I saw the flashing lights of the police cars approaching. The officers quickly surrounded the RV, weapons drawn. I opened the door, hands raised, and they rushed in, securing the area. They found the man a short distance away, bleeding and delirious. He was taken into custody and later identified as Leonard Bain, a man who had been missing for over a decade. The police found evidence of his crimes in the warehouse, the remains of several missing persons who had met a gruesome end at his hands. The story made headlines, and I was hailed as a hero for helping to bring him to justice. As the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The forest, which had once been a place of solace, now felt like a place of nightmares. I knew I'd never come back here, but I couldn't forget what happened. Leonard Bain had chosen his isolation, but it had driven him to madness, and I had stumbled into his dark world by chance. The authorities cleaned up the site, and the remains were identified and returned to their families. Life went on, but I was forever changed by that encounter. The scars on my neck were a constant reminder of how close I'd come to death. In the end, I realized that sometimes the monsters we fear aren't hiding in the dark. They're right there in plain sight, wearing the face of a man who just wanted to be left alone. And sometimes the only way to survive is to fight back, no matter how terrifying the odds. My name is Lila Carter, and I'm 35 years old. I'm a middle school teacher from Indiana. This happened in May of last year, during a solo camping trip at Potato Creek State Park. At the time, I thought I just needed a weekend away, some time to decompress after the chaos of the school year. But what I found out there wasn't peace. It was something I don't think I'll ever truly escape. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, late enough that the sun was already starting to sink behind the trees. Potato Creek is beautiful, with wide open lakes and dense forest trails that seem to stretch forever. I parked my old RV at the site near the water and set up my little camp. A folding chair by the fire pit, my journal and pens on the picnic table. It wasn't much, but it was all I needed. The first issue popped up almost immediately. The generator on my RV wouldn't stay on for more than a few minutes before sputtering out. I cursed under my breath. Without it, I wouldn't have power for lights or to charge my phone. I reminded myself I'd come here to unplug anyway and shrugged it off. As I was unpacking, I noticed something odd. A deer stood at the edge of the woods, staring directly at me. That wasn't unusual in itself, but the way it stood there, perfectly still like a statue, sent a ripple of unease through me. When I waved my arms to scare it off, it didn't flinch. It just turned its head slightly as if trying to understand me, then disappeared into the trees. I tried not to think about it as I made dinner. Night fell quickly, bringing a heavy silence with it. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just stillness. It was unsettling. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, and that's when I heard that whistling. It was faint at first, just a few notes carried by the breeze. I assumed it was another camper, but when I strained my ears, I realized it wasn't coming from the nearby sites. It was coming from deep in the woods. I don't know why, but the sound unsettled me. I went inside the RV and locked the door. When I checked my phone, I saw that I had no signal. Not surprising, given how remote the area was. I tried to sleep, but my dreams were strange that night. I kept hearing someone whispering my name over and over. When I finally woke up, drenched in sweat, I realized the RV door was slightly ajar. My heart nearly stopped. I was certain I'd locked it before going to bed. The next morning, I decided to shake off the weirdness and go for a hike. The fresh air felt good, and I started to relax as I walked the trails. That's when I saw the footprints. They were barefoot, large, but with long, twisted toes, almost like claws. They weren't human, but they weren't animal either. They appeared out of nowhere in the dirt and led off the trail into the dense underbrush. I stood there, staring at them, my gut telling me to turn back, but I shook it off. It's just some weird animal, I told myself. Probably a bear. When I got back to my campsite, I met Jaden. He was camping a few sites down and seemed about my age, mid-30s, with a friendly smile and a bit of a nosy streak. "You camping alone?" he asked, glancing at my RV. I nodded and he raised an eyebrow. "You're braver than me. This place has a weird vibe, you know?" I laughed nervously and tried to brush him off, but he kept talking. "You heard the stories about this area? The Skinwalker legend?" I shook my head, even though the word sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard it before somewhere, but I couldn't remember the details. "It's an old Native American story," Jaden explained. "They say it's a shapeshifter, a spirit that can take the form of anything it wants. People, animals. It mimics voices, tries to lure you into the woods. Once you see it, you're pretty much screwed." He grinned, like it was all a big joke, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "Thanks for the bedtime story," I said dryly, trying to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the knot forming in my stomach. That night, I heard the whistling again, louder this time. It started faint, like the night before, but it grew closer and closer until it sounded like it was right outside the RV. Then it stopped, replaced by silence. I stayed perfectly still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lila," a voice called softly. My blood turned to ice. It was my voice. "Lila," it said again, this time with a strange rasping tone. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a flashlight, and crept toward the window. My hands were shaking as I peeked outside. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed something standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. It looked like me, but wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its face twisted into a grotesque grin. I stumbled back, my heart racing. No, I whispered, barely able to breathe. The thing outside started scratching at the RV door, slow and deliberate, the sound making my skin crawl. "Lila, let me in," it said, still using my voice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat huddled in the corner of the RV, clutching the flashlight, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally rose, I dared to open the door. There were long claw marks running down the side of the RV, and my campsite was in disarray. Chairs knocked over, food scattered everywhere. Jaden's campsite was silent. When I went to check on him, his tent was slashed open, and his belongings were strewn about like mine. A dark stain, blood, I realized, marked the ground near the fire pit. I called out for him, but there was no answer. Panic set in. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I needed to leave, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but it was no use. The thing had done something to it. I was sure of it. As I stood there trying to figure out what to do, I heard Jaden's voice calling from the woods. "Lila, over here. I need help." It sounded desperate, terrified. "Jaden?" I called back, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" "Just a little further," his voice replied. I froze. Something about the tone wasn't right. It was too flat, too monotone, and then I remembered what Jaden had said about the Skinwalker mimicking voices. My blood ran cold. "I'm not falling for it," I muttered, backing away from the tree line. That's when I saw it. The thing stepped out from the woods. Its body hunched and twisted. It shifted forms right in front of me, going from Jaden to me to something else entirely, something grotesque with long-clawed fingers and glowing yellow eyes. It let out a guttural, inhuman screech and started toward me. I ran back into the RV and slammed the door shut just as the creature reached it. It pounded on the sides, the force shaking the whole vehicle. I grabbed a bag of salt from the cupboard. I remembered hearing somewhere that salt could ward off evil spirits, and poured a circle around myself. The pounding stopped. The creature's face appeared at the window, grinning at me with razor-sharp teeth. It snarled, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. "You can't hide forever, Lila," it hissed, its voice a sickening mixture of mine and Jaden's. "I'll see you soon." It disappeared as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. I stayed in that circle until I was sure it was gone. When I finally dared to step outside, I saw that the creature had carved something into the hood of the RV. "You can't run." I left Potato Creek that morning, abandoning the RV and walking to the nearest ranger station to call for help. They found Jaden's body 2 days later, deep in the woods. His injuries were so horrific that they wouldn't tell me the details. I haven't gone camping since. I don't know if I ever will, but sometimes, late at night, I hear whistling outside my window, and I know it's still out there, waiting for me. My name is Wesley Crane. It's 2015, and I'm sitting in an RV park just outside Yellowstone, wondering how the hell I got here. I'm not really the outdoorsy type, to be honest, but after my divorce last year, I thought it'd be good for me to get away from everything, clear my head, do the whole finding myself thing. I bought an old RV, thinking I'd hit the open road and maybe grow some stubble while pretending to know what I'm doing. I work as an accountant, so my idea of adventure usually involves tax loopholes, not whatever I just went through. To set the stage, I'm parked at this quiet little site, nothing but me, some trees, and the occasional squirrel to keep me company. The park is gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but there's something unnerving about how isolated it feels. You don't realize how much noise there is in a city until you're somewhere like this, where the silence itself is almost loud. I had been camping out for a couple of days already, pretending to enjoy my lukewarms of beans and the lack of decent Wi-Fi when I decided to venture out a little farther than usual. There's this trail that winds up through the woods just past where I parked. A real postcard kind of place. I figured I'd hike for an hour or two, then come back, maybe crack open a beer and convince myself I was becoming a nature guy. The first part of the walk was fine, quiet, peaceful even. There wasn't a soul in sight, which I thought was kind of weird for the height of tourist season, but I figured everyone else had more sense than to hike alone. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw it. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. Maybe a film set I'd accidentally wandered into. There was an RV, not unlike mine, tucked into a small clearing just off the path, but it was trashed. Not like bear attack trashed, but methodical, almost surgical. Doors hanging off, windows smashed, the roof torn out in places. It didn't look like the kind of damage nature could do. No, this was something more deliberate. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped off the trail to check it out. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. It wasn't just the damage, it was the atmosphere. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing down on me. My stomach churned with the kind of unease you can't quite put into words, like you've just remembered something horrible you'd tried to forget. I stopped short of the RV's door, realizing I didn't want to see inside, but by then I'd already seen too much. There was blood. Splashes of it across the side of the vehicle, like someone had thrown a bucket of red paint at it. And there was more, drag marks leading from the RV into the woods. It didn't take a genius to know something bad had happened here. I should have turned back right then, sprinted down that trail, and never looked back. But no, like an idiot, I stepped closer. Inside, the place was torn apart, furniture overturned, dishes shattered on the floor, personal belongings scattered everywhere. It was like someone had been living there 1 second, and then suddenly, wasn't. The worst part, though, wasn't the blood or the destruction. It was the suitcase. A half-packed suitcase sitting on the bed as if someone had been about to leave but never got the chance. I'm not sure how long I stood there just staring at it, my brain trying to catch up with what I was seeing. Long enough, apparently, for the owner of the RV to come back. It was a sound, a twig snapping behind me, that jolted me out of my stupor. I turned around so fast I nearly tripped over myself, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, but that wasn't what set off the alarm bells in my head. It was the look on his face, a kind of calm that didn't belong in a scene like this. He wasn't surprised to see me. In fact, it felt like he'd been expecting me. He stepped closer, too close for comfort, and my mouth went dry. He had this casual way about him, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wasn't worried about consequences. His clothes were dirty, but not in the "I've been camping" way. More like, "I've been living out here, away from the law" kind of dirty. "You lost?" His voice was quiet, controlled, not threatening, but definitely not friendly either. I stammered out some excuse about getting off the trail, how I didn't mean to intrude, but the way he looked at me, it was like he could see right through the lies. He glanced at the RV, then back at me, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. I'll tell you this, people talk about fight or flight, but there's a third option they don't always mention: freeze. And that's exactly what I did, like a deer in headlights, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then he smiled, and that's when I knew I was screwed. I don't remember much about what happened next. One second, he was a few feet away, and the next he was on me, hands around my neck, squeezing. I don't even think he was trying to kill me. Not yet, just testing me, like a cat plays with a mouse. I thrashed, managed to elbow him in the ribs, and for a second, his grip loosened just enough for me to get away. I ran blindly, stupidly, crashing through the trees, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy but unhurried, like he knew the woods better than I ever could. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks tripping me up, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. If I stopped, I was dead. Eventually, I burst back onto the main trail, my lungs on fire, legs shaking like jelly. I half collapsed behind a boulder, trying to quiet my breathing, praying he hadn't followed, but I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just silence. I don't know how long I stayed there, huddled in that spot, waiting. Time felt strange, stretched out, like I was stuck in some kind of nightmare loop, but he never came. When I finally mustered the courage to move, I bolted back to the RV park, not stopping until I slammed the door of my camper shut behind me. For the next few hours, I sat in silence, too scared to even peek out the windows. But nothing happened. No knocks on the door, no shadowy figure lurking in the trees, just the oppressive weight of everything I'd seen. I don't know why I didn't call the cops right then and there. Maybe part of me didn't believe it really happened, or maybe I was just too damn scared. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the RV made me jump. Every gust of wind had me convinced he was out there, waiting for me to slip up. The next morning, I packed up and left, driving as far and as fast as I could. I didn't look back, not once. A few days later, after I'd put some distance between me and Yellowstone, curiosity got the better of me. I did some digging. Turns out, the guy I ran into had a name: Harvey Dunn, former Marine, dishonorably discharged for reasons that were never made public. He'd gone off the grid about 5 years ago, and there were rumors, ugly ones, about people who'd crossed his path and never been seen again. Authorities had been looking for him, but he was like a ghost, popping up in random places, always just out of reach. The RV I found? It belonged to a couple from Ohio. Their bodies were discovered 2 weeks later, buried not far from where I'd been. So yeah, I got lucky. Real lucky. But Harvey's still out there, and I've got a feeling our paths will cross again. Maybe next time I won't be so lucky. My name is Nicholas Harris, and I'm 57 years old. This happened in the fall of 2022, just after I retired as a forest ranger. I had spent over 30 years in the wilderness patrolling trails, chasing off bears, and sometimes even helping lost hikers find their way back to safety. You'd think a man like me would have no reason to be afraid of the woods, but I'm telling you what I experienced in the Hoare National Forest will haunt me for the rest of my days. I had just bought an old RV, a 1988 Winnebago. Nothing fancy, but it ran well enough. The plan was simple: park it somewhere secluded, spend a few days camping, and finally get the peace I had been craving. My wife, Catherine, used to love trips like this. She passed 5 years ago in a hiking accident, one I couldn't prevent, and I still carry the guilt of it. I thought this trip might help me reconnect with her memory and maybe even forgive myself. I chose the Sycamore Trail in Hoare National Forest. It's not as busy as some of the other spots, and I knew the land like the back of my hand. The locals had always told stories about the area, warnings to stay away from certain trails, whispers of things that didn't belong in those woods. But I'd always chalked it up to superstition. After all, the forest can play tricks on your mind if you're not used to it. The first day went smoothly enough. I parked the RV in a small clearing just off the trailhead. It was a gorgeous spot, the kind of place Catherine would have loved. There was a crisp chill in the air, and the trees were blazed with autumn colors. I set up camp, got a fire going, and cooked myself a simple meal of canned chili. The only problem was my equipment. My old flashlight was flickering, and my camp stove gave me trouble lighting up. Nothing major, just annoyances, or so I thought. That night, as I sat by the fire, I started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. The woods were quieter than they should have been. No crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of leaves. Just dead silence. Then, just as I was about to head inside the RV, I heard something. Nicholas. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone was calling my name. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice sounded familiar. Too familiar. It sounded like Catherine. Nicholas, help me. The voice was coming from deep in the woods, beyond the reach of my firelight. My heart was racing. I told myself it couldn't be her. It couldn't. But it sounded so real, so desperate. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the darkness. I didn't go far. My flashlight barely worked, and the further I moved from the fire, the darker and colder it got. That's when I saw them. Tracks in the mud. They were strange, like a mix between human footprints and animal paw prints, as if someone had been walking barefoot but with claws. They led in a wide circle around my RV before disappearing into the woods. I stood there staring at the tracks, trying to make sense of them. That's when I heard the voice again, closer this time. Nicholas, please, it hurts. It was Catherine, or at least it sounded like her. Who's there? I shouted, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound tough. The forest didn't answer. I backed away slowly, my flashlight flickering, and retreated to the safety of the RV, locking the door behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a bird mimicking her voice, maybe I was hearing things, but deep down I knew better. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent the morning exploring the trail, hoping a good hike would clear my head. The woods were still unnervingly quiet, but nothing unusual happened. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. That's when the rain started. Light at first, then heavy. I sprained my ankle slipping on the wet ground while fetching firewood, cursing under my breath as I hobbled back to the RV. The storm made the forest even darker, and the flickering flashlight wasn't much help. That night, I heard scratching. It started faint, like branches brushing against the RV, but it grew louder and more deliberate. Something, or someone, was outside. I peered through the window, but all I saw was darkness. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp knocks on the side of the RV, followed by silence. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed my hunting rifle and edged toward the door. My heart pounded as I threw it open, aiming into the night. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the faintest outline of a figure in the trees, tall and impossibly thin. The next morning, I decided to leave. I'd had enough, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood only to find deep scratches gouged into the metal, like claw marks. My chest tightened. I was trapped. Desperation took over. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike out, sprained ankle or not. But as I started down the trail, the forest seemed different. The trees felt closer, the shadows darker, the air thick, oppressive. Every step I took felt like I was being watched. Then I saw it. It was standing in the middle of the trail, about 50 yards ahead. At first it looked human, long limbs, pale skin, but as I stepped closer, its head jerked unnaturally, and its body twisted, bending in ways no human body should. It turned toward me, and I swear it smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too many. "Nicholas, back," it said in Catherine's voice. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my rifle. It started walking toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I ran. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could, the creature's laughter echoing behind me. When I reached the old fire tower, I climbed up, hoping the height would give me an advantage. The creature followed. It circled the base of the tower, its voice shifting between Catherine's pleas and a low guttural growl. "Nicholas, don't leave me," it whispered, its voice distorted and mocking. I remembered the stories, the ones I used to laugh at, skinwalkers, creatures that could mimic voices, take on forms, and lure people to their deaths. The locals had always said salt could repel them. It was worth a shot. I dug into my pack and poured a ring of salt around the platform, gripping my rifle tightly. The creature climbed halfway up the tower, but as it neared the salt, it recoiled, letting out an ear-piercing shriek. It stared at me for a long moment, its dark eyes burning with rage, before it slithered back down the ladder and disappeared into the woods. When the sun rose, I climbed down the tower, my legs trembling. The forest felt lighter, less oppressive, but the tracks in the mud told me the creature was still out there. I hobbled back to the RV, praying the engine would start. This time, it did. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it standing at the edge of the forest. It didn't follow me, but I knew it was watching. I haven't been back to the Hoare National Forest since. I sold the RV, gave up camping, and tried to move on. But at night, I still hear Catherine's voice calling to me from the darkness, and I'll never forget those eyes. My name is Michael Lopez, and I'm 25 years old. This happened in October of last year when my best friend Sophia and I decided to spend a weekend camping at Dogwood Lake, deep in the heart of southern Indiana. I'll never forget those days, no matter how hard I try. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the laughter. Sophia and I couldn't have been more different. She was bold, impulsive, and always looking for her next adventure. I, on the other hand, preferred plans, structure, and knowing exactly what I was walking into. But she had a way of pulling me out of my comfort zone, and I usually ended up having a good time. Usually, we'd rented an old RV for the trip, a boxy white thing with a sputtering engine that smelled faintly of mildew. I'd suggested staying in a cabin, but Sophia insisted the RV would be more authentic. After some back and forth, I gave in, as I always did. Besides, I was desperate for a break. My teaching job had been wearing me down, and Sophia's promise of crisp autumn air, hiking trails, and kayaking sounded like the reset I needed. We arrived at Dogwood Recreation Area in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the treetops. The forest was alive with color, fiery reds, deep oranges, and golden yellows that reflected off the still surface of the lake. It was beautiful, but something about the place felt off. I chalked it up to exhaustion and a touch of nerves. Sophia, of course, was thrilled. She grabbed her camera and started snapping photos the moment we parked. "Look at this light," she gushed. "It's perfect." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. That was Sophia, always chasing the perfect shot. After setting up camp, we decided to explore. There was a well-marked trailhead nearby, but Sophia had other ideas. She'd spotted a faint path leading off into the woods, one that wasn't on the map. "Let's check it out," she said, already heading in that direction. "Are you serious? It's getting dark," I protested. "That's the best time for photos," she called over her shoulder. "Come on, Michael, don't be such a buzzkill." Reluctantly, I followed. The trail, if you could call it that, was narrow and overgrown, twisting through dense trees that blocked out what little sunlight remained. I kept tripping over roots and brushing cobwebs from my face, muttering under my breath about poison ivy and ticks. Sophia, meanwhile, was in her element, snapping pictures of moss-covered rocks and fallen leaves. Then she found it. At first I thought it was just a piece of trash, something shiny poking out of the dirt. But when Sophia bent down and picked it up, I realized it was a locket, an old one, tarnished and rusted, but still intact. She turned it over in her hands, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Can you believe this? It's so vintage." "It's gross," I said. "Put it back." But she ignored me, rubbing the locket clean on her sleeve. "It's got initials engraved on it. I wonder who it belonged to." "Does it matter? It's trash." She shot me a look. "It's not trash, it's history." Then she slipped the locket into her pocket. "I'm keeping it." I didn't argue. What was the point? Sophia was stubborn, and once she'd made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. That night, things started to feel strange. The heater in the RV wouldn't work, so we huddled under blankets, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was out there watching us. But when I mentioned it to Sophia, she laughed it off. "You're just spooked because it's so quiet out here," she said. "City girl problems." Maybe she was right. I told myself I was imagining things, and eventually drifted off to sleep. Then the dreams started. I was standing by the lake, staring at the water. A woman stood on the shore, her back to me. Her hair was long and dark, and she wore a dress that clung to her as if it were soaked. She was holding something, a locket, I realized. Her shoulders shook as though she were crying, but no sound came out. When she turned around, her face was a mask of rage, her eyes hollow and black. She opened her mouth to scream, and I woke up gasping for air. Across the RV, Sophia was sound asleep, the locket clutched in her hand. The next day, Sophia acted normal, but I couldn't shake the dream. I told her about it over breakfast, expecting her to laugh it off again. Instead, she frowned. "That's weird," she said. "I had a dream too about a woman at the lake." "What did she do?" "She was just standing there, watching me," she shrugged. "It didn't feel scary though, just sad." I wasn't convinced. Something about the locket wasn't right, but Sophia refused to get rid of it. "It's just a coincidence," she said. "Don't freak out." But as the day went on, the unease grew. Wet footprints appeared on the RV floor, even though neither of us had been near the water. Items went missing, a flashlight, Sophia's phone charger, only to turn up later in odd places. And then there were the voices. That evening, as we sat by the fire, I heard it, the faint sound of children laughing. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but Sophia heard it too. "Probably just echoes from another campsite," she said, though her tone was less certain. "There's no one else out here," I whispered. We stared into the darkness, but the laughter faded as quickly as it had come. That night, I woke to the sound of the RV door creaking open. Sophia's bed was empty. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, my heart pounding. The forest was pitch black, the trees casting long shadows under the sliver of moonlight. I found Sophia standing at the edge of the lake, her feet submerged in the water. She was holding the locket, her lips moving as if she were whispering something, though I couldn't hear the words. "Sophia!" I yelled. She turned slowly, her eyes glazed over. "She wants me to stay," she said, her voice distant and hollow. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back to the RV, but she fought me, her strength unnaturally strong. "Let go. I need to go to her." Finally, I managed to drag her inside and lock the door. She collapsed onto her bed and fell into a deep sleep, but I stayed awake, clutching a knife and listening for the sound of footsteps outside. The next morning, Sophia didn't remember a thing. She laughed it off, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The locket's influence was growing stronger, and I knew we had to leave. But the RV wouldn't start. Sophia tried to call for help, but her phone was dead, even though it had been fully charged the night before. I suggested walking back to the main road, but she refused. "I'm not leaving the RV," she said. "What if someone comes by?" I didn't argue. I couldn't leave her alone, not when she was acting so strange. Instead, I decided to confront the problem head-on. That afternoon, while Sophia was napping, I took the locket and walked to the lake. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. I stood at the water's edge, the locket heavy in my hand. "I know you're here," I said. "What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the surface of the lake rippled, and the woman appeared. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes dark pits of sorrow and rage. Behind her, shadowy figures emerged, children with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. "Return it," she hissed, her voice like nails on glass. "Return what you stole." I threw the locket into the water and turned to run, but the children's laughter erupted around me, and I felt icy hands grab my ankles. I screamed, kicking and clawing, but the hands dragged me toward the water. Just as I thought I was going to drown, Sophia appeared, her face twisted with fear and determination. She held a stick lit with fire from the RV's stove. "Let her go," she screamed, thrusting the flame toward the water. The ghostly figures recoiled, their shrieks piercing the air. Sophia grabbed my arm and pulled me back to shore. Together, we watched as the locket sank beneath the surface, the ripples fading into stillness. We left Dogwood Lake the next day, abandoning the RV and hitchhiking back to civilization. Neither of us spoke about what had happened, but I knew we'd both been changed. Sophia never picked up her camera again, and I can't look at a lake without feeling a chill run down my spine. Some nights, I still hear the laughter, soft and distant, like an echo from a nightmare. I pray it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know it's not. My name is Camila Adams. I'm 22 years old, and this happened to me last November. It started as a camping trip in Brown County State Park, Indiana. Just a fun, challenging escape with friends. But what I experienced out there wasn't just nature. Something ancient and evil stalked us through that forest, and I barely made it out alive. It was Mason's idea. He was the ringleader in our group of 3, confident, outdoorsy, and just reckless enough to convince us this trip was a good idea. He was 26, with that charming, cocky smile that somehow made me trust him even when I shouldn't. Then there was Ben, Mason's best friend since childhood. He was 25, and the opposite of Mason, reserved, practical, and constantly trying to keep us from getting into trouble. Me? I was just there for the adventure. I'd been feeling stuck lately, living the same routine in Indianapolis, and Mason's enthusiasm made me want to break out of my comfort zone. So when he suggested we tackle an unofficial trail he'd found on some wilderness forum, I thought, why not? We packed light. Mason insisted we didn't need much for a 3-day trip. Looking back, that was mistake number 1. The first day went fine. We parked at the trailhead and hiked deeper into the park than I'd ever been. The colors of the late autumn forest were stunning, rich reds and golds under a steel gray sky. Mason led the way with his usual bravado, joking about how we didn't even need a map because he had the route all figured out. Ben kept muttering about how we should at least double-check our bearings, but Mason brushed him off. By the time we reached our first campsite, we were tired, but in good spirits. We set up a small fire, ate some protein bars, and talked about everything and nothing under the canopy of stars. It was peaceful until the forest went silent. I didn't notice it at first, but Ben did. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" Mason replied, poking at the fire. "Nothing," Ben said. "No crickets, no owls, nothing." Now that he mentioned it, the silence felt wrong. It pressed down on us like a weight, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mason shrugged it off, saying it was probably the cold weather, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The second day was harder. The hidden path Mason had raved about turned out to be more of a rough deer trail, barely visible under the thick leaves. My legs ached from climbing over fallen trees and trudging through uneven ground. To make matters worse, Ben's compass stopped working. He swore it had been fine yesterday, but now the needle spun uselessly, as if the forest itself was messing with us. Around midday, we found something strange. Deep claw marks scored the bark of a massive oak tree. They were too high up to be from a bear, if there were even bears in this part of Indiana. Mason joked about Bigfoot, but Ben's face darkened. "This isn't right," Ben said. "We should turn back." "Turn back? Come on, man, we're fine," Mason said. "Don't wimp out now." Ben shot me a look that said, "Can you believe this guy?" I wanted to agree with him, but I didn't want to be the one to back down first. So we kept going. That night, the hunger started. Mason devoured most of our food. He claimed he hadn't eaten enough earlier and needed the energy, but the way he tore through the rations was unsettling. His hands shook as he unwrapped granola bars, and his eyes had this wild, hollow look. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, just starving," he muttered, not meeting my gaze. "Don't worry about it." Ben pulled me aside while Mason stomped off to gather more firewood. "Something's wrong with him," Ben whispered. "He's acting off." "I know," I said. "But what are we supposed to do? Drag him back to the car?" Ben didn't answer. He just stared into the dark woods, his jaw tight. Later that night, I heard whispering. I'd stepped away from the campfire to use the bathroom. The air was freezing, my breath puffing white in front of me. That's when I heard it, a low, raspy murmur just beyond the tree line. "Ben? Mason?" I called, my voice shaking. There was no answer, only the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot, too far away to be either of them. I ran back to camp, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" Mason asked when he saw me. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "Someone's out there," I said, trying to catch my breath. "I heard them." "It's probably just the wind," Mason said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Ben pulled out the flimsy flashlight Camila had packed, the beam flickering weakly as he scanned the surrounding trees. "We need to leave first thing in the morning," he said. Morning didn't come fast enough. I woke up to the sound of Mason vomiting behind the tent. When I went to check on him, I saw blood mixed in with the bile. "You're sick," I said, panic rising in my chest. "We have to get you out of here." "No," Mason rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Ben snapped. "You look like death, and now we're out of food, thanks to you." Mason glared at him, his teeth bared. For a moment, I thought he was going to lunge at Ben, but then he stumbled back, clutching his stomach. "Let's just keep moving," he said through gritted teeth. We packed up and started hiking, but Mason was slower now, his breath labored. The trail seemed to twist in on itself, leading us deeper into the forest instead of out. The claw marks appeared more frequently, gouged into the trees like some kind of territorial warning. And then we found the carcass. It was a deer, or at least what was left of one. Its ribs jutted out like spears, the flesh stripped away as if something had gnawed on it. The smell was overwhelming, rotting meat and coppery blood. Mason stared at it for a long time, his eyes wide and unblinking. "We need to keep moving," Ben said, grabbing my arm. That night, Mason disappeared. Ben and I woke up to find his sleeping bag empty, his boots gone. "We have to find him," I said, but Ben shook his head. "He's gone, Camila. We can't save him." "We can't just leave him out there," I yelled. Ben sighed, his face lined with exhaustion. "Fine, but if we don't find him by sunset, we're heading back." We followed a faint trail of footprints, half expecting to find Mason sitting by a tree, laughing about some stupid prank. Instead, we found him crouched over another deer carcass, his face smeared with blood. "Mason?" I called out softly. He turned to look at us, and my stomach dropped. His eyes were sunk, his skin stretched taut over his cheekbones, his lips pulled back in a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that looked too sharp, too jagged. "The hunger," he whispered. "It's inside me." Ben grabbed my hand, pulling me back. "Run," he said. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, but Mason, or whatever he'd become, was fast. I could hear him behind us, his ragged breathing growing louder, closer. "Go!" Ben shouted, shoving me forward. "I'll hold him off." "No!" I screamed, but Ben didn't stop. He turned to face Mason, wielding a large branch like a spear. I didn't see what happened next. I just kept running, tears streaming down my face as I heard Ben's screams echoing through the trees. I stumbled out of the forest at dawn, bloodied and half frozen. Park rangers found me near the trailhead and took me to a hospital. I told them everything, but they didn't believe me. They said Mason and Ben probably got lost and that I was lucky to make it out alive. But I know the truth. Somewhere in those woods, the Wendigo still roams, hungry and waiting for its next victim. My name's Samuel Neven. And back in 2004, I was working as a search and rescue officer in the Daniel Boone National Forest, Kentucky. I didn't grow up around here, though. I came from Indiana, a flat, uneventful place where the most excitement you'd get was a speeding ticket. The move to Kentucky was supposed to bring some adventure, and let me tell you, I got more than I bargained for. When I first got into this line of work, people said it was mainly about finding lost hikers or kids who wandered off the trails. They didn't warn me about the other things in the woods, the things you can't categorize. You see, I wasn't exactly what you'd call an experienced outdoorsman before I took this job. The closest I got to wildlife was grilling burgers in my backyard. But the forest grew on me. It felt like freedom. That was until the day it stopped feeling safe. It was mid-afternoon when the call came in. 2 campers, both young men, had gone missing near Red River Gorge. They had set out the previous morning and hadn't checked back with their friends. That wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. People lose track of time out here all the time. But something about the tone of the call had me on edge. Their friends said they weren't the type to just disappear without a trace. I grabbed my gear and met up with my partner, Carl, an older guy who'd been doing this longer than I'd been alive. He had that look of someone who'd seen it all, but didn't say much about it. As we drove out to the trailhead, Carl kept tapping the wheel like he had something on his mind. Finally, he said, "You ever hear about that thing up in the gorge?" I glanced at him. "What thing?" He didn't answer right away. "Never mind," he muttered. "Just some stories the locals like to tell to scare tourists." We pulled up to the trailhead where we met the friends of the 2 missing campers. They were all rattled, wide-eyed, and shuffling nervously like something bad had already happened. One of them, a guy with a red bandana wrapped around his head, said they had been hiking together when the 2 missing guys went ahead, wanting to explore a cave they'd found. The rest of the group stayed back, and when their friends didn't return by nightfall, they started worrying. Carl, never one for comforting words, just grunted and motioned for me to follow him. We set out on the trail, winding through dense trees and jagged cliffs. The forest was quiet, too quiet. You start to notice these things when you've been out here long enough. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the wind and our footsteps crunching on the dirt. "Shouldn't there be, some wildlife or something?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Carl didn't respond, just picked up the pace, which wasn't exactly reassuring. About an hour in, we found the campsite the missing campers had set up. Tents were there, unzipped, sleeping bags tossed around like they'd left in a hurry. A couple of backpacks were strewn across the ground. What was strange, though, was that there were no signs of a struggle, just an eerie sense of abandonment. I crouched down near one of the backpacks, rifling through it for clues. Inside, I found the usual camping gear, but then I pulled out something odd, a torn piece of fur. It was coarse, thicker than anything I'd seen on a bear or deer. I showed it to Carl, but he just shrugged it off, mumbling something about wild animals. As we moved further into the forest, the trees began to close in around us, their twisted limbs casting distorted shadows on the ground. I felt like we were being watched, like something was out there, just beyond the tree line. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, nothing was there. About half a mile later, we came across something that made my blood run cold. One of the missing campers was slumped against a tree, his body mangled beyond recognition. His torso was torn open, jagged cuts running along his chest and arms, as if something had sliced him up with claws or teeth. There was no blood on the ground, though, which made it even more unsettling. Whatever did this didn't just kill him, it took its time. I staggered back, feeling bile rise in my throat. Carl knelt down to examine the body, his face grim but not surprised. "This isn't normal," he muttered. "No kidding," I whispered. "What could have done this?" Carl stood up slowly, scanning the area. "Not sure, but we need to find the other one." The other one, right. There were 2. I had almost forgotten. My mind was still reeling from the sight in front of me. But we had a job to do. We pressed on, following a faint trail of broken branches and disturbed underbrush. It was getting darker, but we couldn't turn back now. About an hour later, we found the second camper, or at least what was left of him. His body was hanging from a tree, suspended by a mess of vines and branches. It looked like he'd been lifted up and shredded apart, his limbs dangling at odd angles. I could barely breathe at this point. It was like we had stumbled into some twisted hunting ground. "We should call this in," I said, my voice shaking. Carl didn't move. He was staring at something off to the side, just beyond the body. "Look!" I followed his gaze and saw it. Movement in the trees. Something was crouching low, its shape barely visible in the shadows. It was huge, larger than anything I'd ever seen before. Its body was covered in matted fur, like that of a wild boar, but its movements were more feline, smooth and predatory. The creature's head was elongated, almost like a wolf's, but it had this strange, twisted quality to it, as if nature had gone wrong somewhere. It stood there for a moment, staring at us, before letting out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in my chest. Carl grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my daze. "Run?" I always figured if anything bad ever happened to me, it would be out on the open road, miles away from anyone who could help. Maybe that's why I started carrying a gun. I never wanted to feel helpless. Not that I've had to use it before, but it's there, tucked under the seat of my rig, just in case. The highway was quieter than usual that night, and I was heading west, cutting through some remote stretch of Wyoming. The air was crisp, a bite of winter hanging on, even though it should have been warmer by now. I had a load of lumber bound for some construction site in Idaho. Nothing out of the ordinary. My mind was on the job. The kind of solitary thinking that comes when you're hours into a long haul. It wasn't until I hit the small, nearly forgotten town of Pine Ridge that things started to feel off. Not that there was much to the place. A single gas station, a diner that looked like it hadn't served a hot meal in years, and a couple of houses with their windows boarded up. I needed to refuel, so I pulled into the gas station, the only sign of life in the whole town. The pump was ancient, the kind where you have to flip the lever to start the gas flowing. As I filled up, I noticed the attendant inside the station, a wiry man with a weathered face. He was watching me, his eyes never leaving me. I gave him a nod, more out of habit than friendliness, but he didn't respond, just kept staring like he was sizing me up. It made my skin crawl, but I chalked it up to small-town suspicion. Strangers don't exactly roll through Pine Ridge every day. I paid for the gas and got back in the truck, eager to put some miles between me and that town. As I pulled out, I noticed an old beat-up pickup truck parked on the side of the road. I hadn't seen it when I pulled in. But then again, I wasn't paying much attention. The thing looked like it hadn't run in years, rust eating away at the body and the tires flat against the pavement. An hour later, the road was deserted, just a ribbon of black cutting through the wilderness. That's when I saw the headlights in my mirror. At first, it was just a faint glow, but they got closer. Fast. Too fast. My heart picked up, and I checked my speed. Maybe I was going too slow, but no, I was doing the limit. The lights got brighter, and I could make out the outline of the vehicle behind me. It was that old pickup from Pine Ridge, the same rusted hulk that looked like it shouldn't even be on the road. I kept my eyes on the mirror, expecting the truck to pass me by, but it didn't. Instead, it rode my tail, the headlights nearly blinding me. I tapped the brakes, a warning, but the pickup didn't back off. If anything, it got closer. Something wasn't right. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but the pickup matched my speed, staying just a few feet behind me. The road ahead was nothing but darkness, and my mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I reached under the seat, feeling for the cold metal of the gun. My hand gripped the handle, but I didn't pull it out, not yet. There was a turn up ahead, a sharp one. I could lose him there, maybe. I flicked on my blinker, even though there was no one else around to see it, and took the turn hard. For a moment, I thought I'd lost him. The road curved through a dense patch of trees, and I couldn't see the headlights anymore. But then they reappeared, brighter than before as the pickup tore around the bend, nearly clipping the back of my rig. Panic set in, and I floored it, the engine roaring as I pushed the truck faster than I'd ever dared before. The pickup stayed with me, relentless. I couldn't shake him. And then, like something out of a nightmare, he started ramming me. The first hit jolted me so hard I almost lost control. My trailer fishtailed, the weight of the lumber threatening to tip the whole rig over. I gripped the wheel tighter, fighting to keep us on the road. Another hit, harder this time, and I knew I had to do something, or he'd run me off the road completely. I glanced at the gun still under the seat, but the thought of using it while driving terrified me. Instead, I scanned the road ahead, looking for anything that might help. Up ahead, I saw a narrow dirt road branching off to the right. It wasn't on my map, and I had no idea where it led, but it was my only option. I cut the wheel hard, veering off the main road onto the dirt path. The rig shuddered as the tires hit the rough ground, and I prayed the trailer wouldn't flip. The pickup followed right on my tail, its headlights bouncing in the darkness. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for my truck, and lined with thick trees on either side. I could hear the pickup's engine roaring behind me, getting closer and closer. My mind raced with desperate ideas, none of them good. I could try to lose him in the trees, but one wrong move, and I'd be wrapped around a trunk. And then, out of nowhere, the road ended. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding in the dirt, and the rig came to a stop just inches from a steep drop-off. The pickup didn't stop. It rammed into the back of my trailer with a sickening crunch, and I heard metal tearing as the trailer swayed dangerously over the edge. The impact threw me forward, and I fought to stay in control. I could feel the weight of the lumber shifting, the whole rig threatening to go over. I had seconds, maybe less. I didn't think. I yanked the gun out from under the seat, kicked open the door, and jumped out. I hit the ground hard, rolling to avoid the drop-off. The pickup's engine was still running, the headlights casting an eerie glow over the scene. I scrambled to my feet, the gun in my hand, and turned to face the pickup. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in grease and grime, his clothes tattered, hanging off him like they'd been through hell. He didn't say a word, just started walking toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. I leveled the gun at him, my hands shaking. "Stay back!" I shouted, but he kept coming. Closer now, I could see his face. It was twisted, scarred, like he'd been in 100 fights and lost every one of them. His eyes were cold, empty, like there was nothing human left inside him. He didn't stop. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the trees, and the man staggered but didn't go down. He looked at me, more surprised than hurt, and then kept coming. I fired again, and this time he dropped to one knee, blood seeping through his shirt. But he wasn't dead. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a knife, and lunged at me. I fired a third time, hitting him square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, finally still. I stood there, gasping for breath, the gun still in my hand. The night was silent now, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I walked over to the pickup, looking for any sign of why he'd chased me, but there was nothing. The cab was empty, no ID, no belongings, just a truck that shouldn't have been running. I looked back at the man, his body lying lifeless on the ground. There was no question he was dead. I had the gun, the spent shells, and his blood on my hands. This wasn't something I could just drive away from. But as I stood there, I realized something else. The rig was teetering on the edge, the weight of the lumber pulling it closer to the drop-off. I ran back to it, climbed inside, and slowly, carefully backed it away from the edge. Once I was clear, I drove back to the main road, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I found a diner that was still open. I sat in a booth, the gun hidden in my jacket, and ordered a coffee. The waitress gave me a strange look, but didn't say anything. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not even the cops. When they eventually found the man's body a few days later, the newspapers called it a tragic accident. An unidentified man found dead in the woods. They never connected it to me, and I never offered up any information. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and got back on the road. The sun was starting to rise, and I had miles to go before my next stop. As I drove, I tried not to think about the man or why he'd come after me. It didn't matter now. He was dead, and I was still alive. That was enough. I thought this trip would fix everything. I thought that a week out in the woods, just me and Tyler, would somehow repair the damage from the past year. The divorce hit him harder than it hit me, and that's saying something. I thought maybe, out here in the quiet, away from the distractions of phones and the city, we could connect again. You know, like fathers and sons are supposed to. But from the moment we hit the road, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Tyler barely looked up from his phone the entire drive, earbuds in, scrolling mindlessly. He didn't care about the scenery, didn't care that we were headed to Deadwood Creek, a place I used to go with my own dad when I was his age. It's funny how history repeats itself. My father and I never really saw eye to eye either. He'd brought me out here, hoping to teach me how to be a man, how to survive in the wilderness, and now here I was, doing the same with Tyler, hoping the Black Hills would heal something in both of us. I glanced at him as we pulled into the campground. He didn't even notice the tall, dark pines surrounding us, swaying lightly in the wind. A dense fog had settled over the creek, and the sound of water trickling nearby was the only noise besides the RV's engine. It felt different than I remembered, more isolated, lonelier. "This is it," I said, more to myself than to Tyler. "Cool," he mumbled, still scrolling, not even looking up. I sighed, cutting the engine. After we set up camp, I suggested a short hike to check out the creek. Tyler grumbled but followed me. The trail was just as I remembered, narrow, winding through the trees, with the creek gurgling beside us. There was something peaceful about it, but also something off. The further we went, the heavier the air felt, like the forest was watching us. We reached the creek's edge, where the water ran fast over the rocks. I crouched down, letting the cool water run over my hand. "This place used to be full of miners back in the gold rush days," I said, trying to make conversation. "A lot of people came out here looking to strike it rich. Some of them didn't make it out." Tyler shrugged. "I guess," he said. I stood up and brushed off my hands. Frustrated. "You know, you could try enjoying this." He looked up from his phone for the first time and scowled. "I didn't ask to come here." I bit my tongue, holding back the argument that wanted to burst out. "Let's head back to camp." As we turned to leave, something flickered in my peripheral vision. I stopped, squinting through the trees. There, just at the edge of the clearing, a dim light floated in the distance. It flickered like a lantern, swaying in the wind. "Did you see that?" I asked, pointing toward the trees. Tyler glanced up, following my gaze. "What? That light?" It was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I'd imagined it. The fog had thickened while we were by the creek, and the woods were growing darker. Never mind, let's go. The first night was when things started getting weird. Tyler and I had retreated to the RV after dinner. He was predictably glued to his phone while I tried to read a book, but the quiet gnawed at me. The stillness outside felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The wind had picked up, and the pines swayed ominously against the backdrop of the night. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a soft, barely there sound like whispers carried on the breeze. But as I listened, it grew more distinct. Not the wind, voices, faint, disembodied voices murmuring just outside the RV. "Did you hear that?" I asked, sitting up straighter. "What?" Tyler didn't even look up. "The voices outside." Tyler pulled out one of his earbuds, frowning. "What are you talking about?" I stood up and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing but fog and trees. But I could still hear the whispers just at the edge of hearing, like they were coming from the creek. I shook my head. Probably just the wind. Tyler rolled his eyes and went back to his phone, but something about those whispers unsettled me. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, the air felt even heavier. Tyler was still distant, sulking around camp, so I suggested another hike, hoping it would clear the tension between us. He reluctantly agreed, and we set off down the trail again, heading back toward the creek. But this time, the unease I'd felt the day before was stronger. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a branch set me on edge. As we walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was constant now, like eyes were following us from the shadows. Then I saw it again. The light. This time it was brighter, flickering between the trees ahead of us, moving slowly, like a lantern being carried by an unseen hand. "There it is," I whispered, grabbing Tyler's arm. "Do you see it?" He stopped, frowning. What? What are you talking about?" The light flickered in and out, growing dimmer before vanishing completely. I took a step forward, but Tyler grabbed my arm. "Dad, let's just go back." I wanted to argue, but the look on his face, the fear in his eyes, stopped me. Truth be told, I was scared too. "Yeah, let's go." That night, the footsteps started. It was late, maybe past midnight, and I just managed to drift off when I heard them. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel outside the RV. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the steps were too heavy, too purposeful. I lay there, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps circled the RV. They stopped by the window, then moved to the door. Tyler stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. I slipped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward the window, slowly pulling back the curtain. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, and there, just at the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was tall, dressed in ragged, old-fashioned clothes, like something out of the gold rush era. A wide-brimmed hat covered most of its face, but I could see the gleam of a lantern hanging from its hand. The figure stood perfectly still, just watching the RV. I stumbled back, heart racing. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, but I couldn't find one. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the fog, the light of its lantern disappearing with it. The next day, Tyler was pale and jittery, his usual teenage indifference replaced with genuine fear. He hadn't seen the figure, but he'd heard the footsteps, and the look in his eyes told me he knew something was wrong. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "I know," I replied. "I'll start the RV. We'll head out." But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine sputtered, then went silent. I tried again and again, but the RV wouldn't start. "We're stuck here," I muttered, feeling the weight of dread settle over me. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. The figure was back, pacing around the RV, dragging something behind it. I could hear the heavy scrape of metal on gravel, like chains being dragged along the ground. "Dad, what is that?" Tyler whispered, his face pale with fear. I didn't have an answer. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the door. "Stay inside," I told him. "No, don't go out there," he begged, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't just sit there, listening to the thing outside. I had to confront it. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. The figure was there, standing by the creek, its lantern casting an eerie glow over the water. It didn't move as I approached, just watched me with shadowed eyes. "What do you want?" I shouted, though my voice trembled. "What are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly lifted its arm, pointing to the ground near the water's edge. There, half buried in the mud, was an old rusted gold pan. I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me, the legend, the miner's ghost protecting his lost fortune. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and lifted the pan from the mud. As soon as I touched it, the figure vanished. The footsteps stopped. The whispers and the wind fell silent. The air was lighter. The oppressive weight lifted. I stood there for a long time, holding the gold pan, my mind racing. Then, without looking back, I turned and went back to the RV. The next morning, the RV started without a hitch. We left Deadwood Creek behind, and neither of us spoke about what happened. But as we drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure watching us from the trees. I didn't, but I knew, deep down, that something had happened out there. Something I couldn't explain, something I would never forget. And maybe, just maybe, Tyler and I would be okay. I didn't believe in ghosts. UFOs, or anything supernatural. I spent most of my career chasing down so-called paranormal phenomena and explaining them with cold, hard facts. That was my job, turning superstition into science, myths into measurable data. The Brown Mountain Lights? They were just another mystery waiting for a rational explanation. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV up the winding roads of Pisgah National Forest. The thick trees closed in on either side. The air was crisp and autumn leaves scattered across the path. There was a quiet stillness that made the world feel far away. I should have felt calm, excited even, but as the sun began to sink behind the distant ridges, leaving the forest bathed in shadow, I felt something else. Tension. Shaking it off, I parked the RV at the remote campsite I'd scouted. This was supposed to be a solo trip, a few days to get up close and personal with the Brown Mountain Lights, interview locals, take readings, and prove once and for all that the lights were nothing more than atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. I had all the gear I'd need: high-resolution cameras, thermal scanners, EMF detectors, the works. I wasn't expecting to find anything supernatural, just an anomaly. And anomalies had explanations. But the moment I stepped out of the RV, a chill ran through me. The trees rustled softly, as if whispering some secret I wasn't meant to hear. Focus, I muttered to myself, dragging my gear out and setting up the cameras, angling them toward Brown Mountain Ridge. I had a perfect view of the ridge from my campsite, miles away but clear in the distance. That's where the lights were supposed to appear. By the time I was fully settled in, I was sitting outside the RV, bundled in a jacket, sipping coffee, and staring out into the dark, waiting. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. Then, around midnight, I saw them. At first, they were faint, flickering, small orbs of light hovering just above the ridge. I squinted, adjusting the focus on my binoculars. There they were, three lights bobbing in the air like they were floating on an invisible current. I grabbed my camera, flipping the switch to start recording, but nothing happened. The lens stayed black, the screen dead. What the hell? I muttered, fiddling with the buttons. Fully charged and brand new, the camera shouldn't have malfunctioned. I checked the battery, clicked it back into place, and tried again. Still nothing. Frustration surged through me. This was exactly what I'd come here for. The lights, right there in front of me. And I couldn't even capture them. I stood up, grabbing my thermal scanner, but when I flipped it on, the screen flickered, then went dark. "Come on," I whispered, trying to stay calm. The gear wasn't cheap, and none of it should have been failing, but it was, piece by piece. The lights danced on the ridge, growing brighter, closer. My heart raced. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I was just annoyed. The logical part of my brain struggled to make sense of it. Maybe the electronics were glitching because of interference, some kind of electromagnetic field or something. I took a deep breath, trying to settle my nerves. But the lights, those strange pulsing orbs, kept moving, almost as if they were drifting toward me. The air turned cold. So cold that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. A thin layer of frost started forming on the ground, on the RV windows, on my gear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands beginning to stiffen in the chill. It didn't make sense. The weather forecast had called for a cool night, but nothing like this. I checked my phone's temperature app. 30 degrees heaters? Impossible. I glanced at my surroundings, feeling the silence close in around me. Then I noticed the lights were no longer on the ridge. They were much closer now, floating just above the treetops, flickering like distant fireflies, but larger. Too large. I watched, heart pounding, as they bobbed and weaved. Their glow cast long shadows on the ground. I pulled out my phone to take a video. The screen flashed, then went black. It wouldn't turn on. Frustration boiled over. I slammed the phone down on the camping table. It bounced. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to keep my cool. This was why people got sucked into believing nonsense, because technology failed at the worst possible moment. The lights weren't supernatural. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the cold was messing with the equipment, or some kind of atmospheric distortion. But then I saw the handprints. Small, faint handprints etched in frost on the RV window. They hadn't been there before. I knew that. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. They looked like the handprints of a child, no more than a few inches across, and they were slowly, gradually melting away in the cold. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I turned to look at the lights, now hovering at the edge of the forest, close enough that I could make out their eerie bluish glow. They flickered in the trees, moving in slow, lazy circles as if they were watching me, waiting for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. There was no way the lights could have traveled that fast. No way they could be this close. I'd seen videos, read reports. They were always distant, spectral, unreachable. But now they felt personal, as if they were beckoning me. I swallowed, my throat tight. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The cold deepened, pressing in on me from all sides. The frost crept up the sides of the RV, spreading like delicate veins. The temperature continued to drop. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The lights drifted deeper into the trees, flickering and glowing, moving in a pattern that felt deliberate, like they wanted me to follow. And I did. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I made my way toward the forest's edge. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the dark. I kept my eyes on the lights, feeling a strange pull in my chest, like something was urging me forward. As I entered the trees, the world grew darker. The lights danced just out of reach, always a few steps ahead of me, their glow casting an ethereal light on the twisted branches. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. I hadn't even noticed. My legs ached, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The lights flickered again, brightening as they circled a large boulder ahead, and then they stopped, hovering there, motionless. I took a step closer, and that's when the hallucinations began. Shapes. Faint figures moving in the trees, shadows stretching unnaturally long. And there, between the branches, I saw faces. Pale, expressionless faces staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. Panic set in. I turned to leave, but the forest had shifted. The path I'd taken was no longer clear. Everything looked the same. The same trees, the same twisting branches. The lights pulsed behind me, glowing brighter as if taunting me. I ran. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find my way back to the campsite. The lights flickered at the corners of my vision, but I ignored them. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light. Quick footsteps crunching through the frost behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran faster, my flashlight flickering and dying in my hand. I broke through the tree line, gasping for air, and saw the RV ahead. A welcome sight. But the air around it was colder than ever. The frost was so thick on the windows that it looked like snow. And there, pressed against the glass, were more handprints. Dozens of them. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me, and collapsed on the floor, panting. My entire body trembled with cold and fear. The lights were still out there. I could see them through the frosted windows, flickering in the trees, growing fainter as the night wore on. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By dawn, they were gone. The temperature returned to normal, and the frost melted away. But I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I packed up the RV and drove out of Pisgah National Forest, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I'd come here to find an explanation, to debunk the Brown Mountain lights. But what I found was something else, something I couldn't explain. And I knew deep down that the lights weren't just a phenomenon. They were something more, something ancient, something dangerous, something that had almost taken me. I don't know what they wanted, but I'll never go back to find out.